Some spy movies are built around realism. Others are built around suspense, sophisticated gadgets, secret identities, and world-threatening villains. But Kingsman, the Secret Service takes those familiar ingredients and throws them into a completely different machine, one powered by outrageous action, British elegance, sharp comedy, explosive violence, and an unapologetically energetic visual style. Released in 2014 and directed by Matthew Vaughn, Kingsman, The Secret Service became one of the most distinctive modern spy films of its era. At first glance, the movie appears to be a playful tribute to classic British espionage. But underneath the tailored suits, secret headquarters, expensive gadgets, and perfectly delivered one-liners is a story about class, identity, mentorship, loyalty, and the transformation of an ordinary young man into an extraordinary agent. The film stars Taron Egerton as Gary Eggsy Unwin, a troubled young man whose life seems to have stalled before it has even properly begun. Eggsy is intelligent and naturally talented, but he comes from a difficult background and has developed a rebellious attitude. His circumstances make him feel trapped. He possesses potential, yet nobody around him seems capable of helping him turn that potential into something meaningful. That changes when he encounters Harry Hart, played by Colin Firth. Harry is everything Eggsy is not. He is disciplined, educated, calm, sophisticated, and seemingly incapable of losing control. He represents the old-school image of the British gentleman spy, complete with immaculate tailoring and extraordinary combat skills. Yet Harry is not simply a mentor who teaches Eggsy how to fight. He becomes the person who recognizes something inside Eggsy that Eggsy himself has almost forgotten: potential. Their relationship becomes one of the emotional foundations of the movie. At the same time, the Kingsman organization faces a terrifying new threat in the form of Richmond Valentine, played by Samuel L. Jackson. Valentine is not a conventional villain. He is eccentric, wealthy, technologically powerful, and obsessed with the future of humanity. His worldview gives the movie its larger conflict, while his bizarre personality allows the film to maintain its unusual mixture of danger and comedy. What makes the movie particularly fascinating is how deliberately it plays with spy film traditions. Instead of simply copying classic espionage movies, Vaughn takes familiar conventions and exaggerates them. The expensive suits become weapons. The umbrella becomes defensive equipment. A simple pair of glasses can become a sophisticated communications device. A refined gentleman can suddenly become an unstoppable fighter. The result is a spy movie that understands the genre well enough to make fun of it while still respecting what makes it entertaining. Development of the film. The development of Kingsman, The Secret Service began in 2012, when Matthew Vaughn became attached to the project. One of the most important decisions in the film's development was Vaughn's decision to step away from directing X-Men: Days of Future Past so that he could concentrate on Kingsman. That decision is particularly interesting because it demonstrates how strongly Vaughn believed in the project. At the time, directing another major superhero film in an established franchise would have been an enormous opportunity. Instead, Vaughn chose to pursue a comparatively different kind of project, one that allowed him to create a new cinematic universe with its own tone, characters, mythology, and visual identity. The screenplay was written by Matthew Vaughn and Jane Goldman and was based on the comic book series The Secret Service. The filmmakers took inspiration from the comic material while shaping the story into something designed specifically for the big screen. The movie's concept was inherently attractive because it offered an opportunity to revisit the traditional spy genre from a modern perspective. Classic spy films often focus on characters who already possess elite skills. The protagonist is usually introduced as an accomplished agent and then sent into an increasingly dangerous mission. Kingsman takes the opposite approach. It begins with someone who appears to be completely unqualified. Eggsy isn't introduced as a polished super spy. He isn't walking into a high-tech headquarters with years of experience. He is a young man struggling with his circumstances, surrounded by people and situations that seem to limit his future. That makes his eventual transformation much more satisfying. The filmmakers also wanted the movie to have a deliberately exaggerated tone. The film could move from serious emotional material to absurd comedy and then into spectacular action without apologizing for the transition. That tonal confidence became one of its defining characteristics: Matthew Vaughn's direction. Matthew Vaughn's direction is one of the biggest reasons Kingsman: The Secret Service feels different from conventional spy films. Vaughn doesn't treat action as something that simply connects one plot point to another. He treats action as a major part of the film's personality. The camera moves aggressively. Characters move through environments with incredible speed. Fights are choreographed to create rhythm and momentum. Editing, sound design, music, and camera movement work together to make the action sequences feel almost like elaborate pieces of choreography. Yet the movie also knows when to slow down. The scenes between Eggsy and Harry are given enough space to establish their relationship. This balance is important because without the emotional connection between the characters, the spectacular action would become empty spectacle. Vaughan also uses visual contrast throughout the film. Eggsy's early environment feels rough, chaotic, and unstable. Kingsman headquarters, by comparison, represent sophistication and control. This contrast isn't merely aesthetic. It reflects Eggsy's journey. He begins in a world where he feels powerless and ends up discovering a world in which his abilities actually have value. The director also uses British cultural imagery to create the movie's unique identity. Tailored suits, expensive cars, elegant interiors, traditional manners, and dry humor are combined with modern technology and extreme action. The result is almost a collision between James Bond, comic book cinema, and contemporary action filmmaking. Colin Firth as Harry Hart. One of the most unexpected aspects of the movie was Colin Firth's transformation into an action star. Firth was already widely known for dramatic performances and sophisticated roles, particularly characters associated with British refinement and restrained emotion. Then Kingsman gave audiences a very different version of him. Harry Hart appears to be the perfect gentleman. He speaks calmly. He dresses impeccably. He carries himself with extraordinary confidence. But beneath that polished exterior is a highly trained operative capable of extraordinary violence when necessary. This contrast becomes one of the film's most entertaining ideas. Harry doesn't need to abandon his gentlemanly identity to become an action hero. Instead, the movie suggests that elegance and physical capability can coexist. His famous approach to manners and violence becomes part of the character's identity. Harry's relationship with Eggsy is equally important. He sees Eggsy's potential despite his troubled circumstances. Instead of judging him entirely by his background, Harry gives him an opportunity. That mentorship gives the film an emotional center. Eggsy doesn't simply learn how to fight. He learns discipline, responsibility, confidence, and self-respect. Taron Egerton as Eggsy. For Taron Egerton, Kingsman became a major breakthrough. Eggsy is a complicated protagonist because he isn't presented as naturally perfect. He makes mistakes. He struggles with authority. He comes from a difficult environment. He has unresolved anger connected to his father and his family circumstances. But the important thing is that Eggsy possesses qualities that aren't immediately obvious. He is intelligent. He is resourceful. He has natural physical ability. Most importantly, he has the capacity to care about other people. The Kingsman training program becomes a test of all these qualities. Eggsy must compete against other candidates who often appear more privileged, more educated, or more prepared than he is. This creates one of the film's strongest themes, the difference between social status and actual ability. The movie repeatedly questions the assumption that wealth, education, and social class automatically make someone superior. Eggsy's journey challenges that idea. His transformation isn't about becoming someone else. It is about learning how to control and develop the abilities he already possesses. Samuel L. Jackson as Richmond Valentine. Samuel L. Jackson brings an entirely different energy to the movie. Richmond Valentine is not the traditional emotionless mastermind. He is eccentric, nervous around violence, and unusually playful. His mannerisms create an intentional contrast with the seriousness of his plans. Valentine believes that humanity has become a threat to the planet. His solution is extreme. He intends to manipulate human behavior on a global scale. That makes him more than simply a villain seeking money or power. He genuinely believes he is solving a problem. This makes the character more interesting because his actions emerge from a twisted interpretation of environmental and social concerns. Jackson's performance also helps maintain the movie's comedic tone. Valentine can discuss horrifying plans while behaving like someone who is almost embarrassed by the violence around him. That strange combination of menace and absurdity fits perfectly into the movie's exaggerated world. The Kingsman organization. One of the film's most appealing concepts is the Kingsman organization itself. Kingsman is essentially a secret intelligence organization operating outside traditional government structures. Its agents are not simply spies. They are carefully selected professionals who combine intelligence, combat training, technology, diplomacy, and social sophistication. The organization has an almost mythical quality. Its headquarters looks less like a conventional military facility and more like a luxury institution. This is intentional. The film presents the Kingsman lifestyle as the ultimate expression of British sophistication. But it also uses the organization to explore the idea of legacy. The Kingsman agents operate according to traditions established by previous generations. Their names, manners, clothing, and methods reflect a culture built around continuity. Eggsy therefore isn't merely entering a new job. He is entering a tradition. That creates an interesting conflict between old values and modern realities. The training process. X's training is another major component of the movie. Rather than immediately becoming an elite agent, he must prove that he belongs among people who have been preparing for this life for years. The training sequences allow the film to explore competition, teamwork, fear, and confidence. The candidates are placed in situations designed to expose their strengths and weaknesses. Some rely on confidence. Others rely on intelligence. Others have physical advantages. X's greatest strength, however, is his ability to adapt. The training therefore becomes a metaphor for personal growth. He begins with uncertainty and gradually develops confidence. This is important because the film doesn't suggest that becoming a hero happens instantly. X has to earn it, the film's action style. The action in Kingsman, the Secret Service, is deliberately exaggerated. Rather than aiming for strict realism, Vaughn creates action sequences that feel almost comic book-like. The choreography is fast, precise, and visually elaborate. The camera often follows the movement of characters in ways that make the audience feel embedded inside the fight. The action scenes also have a strong sense of rhythm. Punches, kicks, movements, explosions, and reactions are edited together almost like musical beats. This approach became one of the movie's signature qualities. The action is not merely about who wins. It is about how the scene feels. That distinction helped the movie stand apart from more grounded spy thrillers. The importance of style. Style is everywhere in Kingsman. The suits are not simply costumes. They are symbols. The film's famous tailoring philosophy connects appearance with identity. For Harry, the suit represents discipline and professionalism. The clothing becomes a visual representation of his development. The gadgets follow the same philosophy. Instead of looking purely futuristic, many Kingsman devices are disguised as ordinary luxury objects. That makes them feel both traditional and modern. An umbrella can become defensive equipment. A watch can have technological functions. A pair of glasses can connect agents to their organization. The film essentially asks, what if the classic gentleman's accessories were secretly advanced spy technology? That idea becomes one of the movie's most enjoyable recurring jokes. Themes of class and opportunity. Although Kingsman is primarily an action comedy, its story contains a surprisingly strong discussion of class. Eggsy comes from a working-class background. Many of the people around him have already decided what his future should look like. The Kingsman world, meanwhile, is dominated by wealth, tradition, and privilege. This creates an obvious social contrast. But the movie does not simply argue that one class is good and another is bad. Instead, it asks whether society often mistakes privilege for ability. Eggsy may lack money and formal social status, but he possesses intelligence, courage, loyalty, and adaptability. The training program demonstrates that when given a genuine opportunity, he can compete with people who have had far more advantages. This makes his story more than a conventional superhero transformation. It is also a story about opportunity. The music and sound. Henry Jackman and Matthew Margeson composed the film's score, helping create the movie's distinctive energetic atmosphere. The music supports both the spy film aesthetic and the modern action style. Traditional cinematic ideas associated with espionage are blended with contemporary rhythms and powerful action cues. Sound design is equally important. Weapons, impacts, explosions, vehicles, and environmental sounds are amplified to make the action feel larger than life. The result is an audio-visual experience that constantly pushes the audience forward. Release and distribution. Kingsman, the Secret Service premiered at Butnumathon in Austin, Texas, on December 13, 2014. It later received its theatrical release in the United Kingdom on January 29, 2015. In the United States, the film was released on February 13, 2015, by 20th Century Fox. The release timing placed the movie in an interesting position. It was clearly designed as a major action spectacle, but it was also unusual enough that its commercial prospects were not necessarily guaranteed. Fortunately for the filmmakers, audiences responded strongly. The film eventually grossed approximately $414 million worldwide. For a movie based on a relatively unfamiliar comic book property, that result was significant. It demonstrated that audiences were willing to embrace original characters and new franchises when the filmmaking had a distinctive identity. Critical reception. Critics generally responded positively to the film. One of the most frequently praised aspects was its tone. The movie understood that it was ridiculous and embraced that quality rather than trying to hide it. Its combination of action, comedy, spy conventions, and comic book exaggeration created something unusual. Colin Firth's performance was particularly notable because it allowed audiences to see him in an unexpectedly physical role. Taron Egerton also received attention for bringing emotional depth and charisma to Eggsy. At the same time, the movie was not universally praised. Some viewers felt that its extreme violence could become excessive. Others believed that its tonal shifts occasionally crossed the line from clever satire into juvenile humor. These criticisms are important because they highlight exactly what makes the film so divisive. Kingsman doesn't compromise much. It wants to be stylish, violent, funny, ridiculous, emotional, and spectacular at the same time. For audiences who enjoy that combination, the movie is exhilarating. For viewers who prefer restrained spy storytelling, it can feel excessive. Why the film connected with audiences? The success of Kingsman can be attributed to several factors. First, it offered a fresh protagonist. Eggsy isn't another perfectly trained spy. He is an underdog. Second, it gave Colin Firth an entirely unexpected action role. Third, Samuel L. Jackson's eccentric villain created a memorable contrast. Fourth, the movie delivered action sequences with a highly recognizable visual identity. And finally, it created a world that could support future stories. The movie felt like the beginning of something larger. That became important because the Kingsman concept had enough flexibility to expand beyond the first film. Legacy and franchise expansion. The success of Kingsman, the Secret Service eventually transformed the movie from a standalone experiment into the beginning of a franchise. A sequel, Kingsman: The Golden Circle, was released in 2017. The franchise later expanded further with The Kingsman, a prequel released in 2021. This expansion demonstrates the strength of the original concept. The filmmakers had created more than a single spy story. They had created an entire mythology surrounding the Kingsman organization. But the original film remains particularly important because it established the tone and identity of the franchise. It introduced the audience to the organization, Harry Hart, Eggsy, the unique technology, the tailored aesthetic, and the unusual combination of comedy and action. Final assessment. Kingsman: The Secret Service succeeds because it understands exactly what kind of movie it wants to be. It doesn't attempt to replace traditional spy cinema. Instead, it takes the genre's familiar ingredients and exaggerates them until they become something new. Matthew Vaughn's direction gives the movie an energetic visual personality. Colin Firth provides the perfect combination of sophistication and physical intensity. Taron Egerton gives Eggsy the vulnerability and charisma necessary to make the character's transformation believable. Samuel L. Jackson turns Richmond Valentine into a bizarre but memorable villain. Together, these elements create a film that feels like a celebration of spy movies while simultaneously making fun of them. Perhaps the most important part of the film is Eggsy's transformation. At the beginning, he is a young man who has been told, directly and indirectly, that his circumstances define him. By the end, he has discovered that his background doesn't have to determine his future. Harry gives him the opportunity. Kingsman gives him the training. But Eggsy ultimately has to prove himself. That message gives the movie emotional weight beneath all the explosions, jokes, gadgets, and spectacular fights. Ultimately, Kingsman: The Secret Service is a movie about becoming more than the world expects you to be. It is a spy adventure. It is an action comedy. It is a comic book adaptation. But at its heart, it is also a coming-of-age story about potential, mentorship, discipline, and opportunity. Its worldwide box office success of roughly $414 million demonstrated that audiences were ready for a different kind of spy movie. And its legacy can still be seen in the franchise that followed. The film's greatest achievement may be that it managed to make the familiar feel new again. The secret agents, expensive suits, evil masterminds, hidden headquarters, technological gadgets, and global threats had all been seen before. But Kingsman combined them with such confidence, humor, energy, and visual creativity that the result became unmistakably its own. That is why Kingsman: The Secret Service remains one of the more memorable modern additions to the spy action genre, a film that doesn't simply ask audiences to watch another secret agent save the world. It asks them to enjoy the spectacle, laugh at the absurdity, appreciate the craftsmanship, and, above all, remember that sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the person with the greatest potential. Kingsman: The Secret Service begins by showing us that the world of secret agents is not as glamorous as it first appears. Behind the elegant suits, expensive gadgets, and sophisticated headquarters are people who make enormous sacrifices to protect others. The movie's opening establishes that idea through the story of Lee Unwin, a Kingsman agent whose final decision will eventually shape the life of his young son, Gary Eggsy Unwin. What begins as a story about an ordinary young man struggling with his circumstances gradually transforms into an explosive spy adventure involving secret organizations, dangerous assassins, global manipulation, and a billionaire determined to reshape humanity. But before Eggsy ever enters the Kingsman world, his story is connected to a sacrifice made 17 years earlier. The sacrifice that changed Eggsy's future. The story takes us back to 1997, when Lee Unwin is serving as a probationary secret agent. During a dangerous mission in the Middle East, Lee finds himself in a situation where someone must make an extraordinary sacrifice. His superior officer is Harry Hart, a Kingsman agent who later becomes known by the codename Galahad. Instead of allowing Harry to die, Lee sacrifices himself. This moment is extremely important because it establishes the emotional relationship between Lee and Harry before Eggsy even becomes part of the story. Lee's death leaves Harry with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He knows that Lee didn't simply die during an ordinary mission. Lee gave his life to save him. That guilt stays with Harry. But Harry also understands that Lee left behind a young son. That child is Eggsy. Harry cannot undo what happened to Lee, but he can make sure that Lee's son is not completely abandoned. He gives Eggsy a medal engraved with an emergency assistance telephone number. At first, this may appear to be nothing more than a sentimental gesture. But the medal is actually a promise. Harry is effectively telling Eggsy that if he is ever in serious trouble, he can call. 17 years later, that promise will become the doorway into Eggsy's new life. 17 years later, Eggsy's difficult reality. When we meet the adult Eggsy, the contrast with the glamorous world of Kingsman couldn't be greater. Eggsy is intelligent and naturally capable, but he is trapped in a difficult environment. He has no clear direction. His home life is unstable, and his relationship with his stepfather, Dean, is especially toxic. Dean represents the kind of person who judges Eggsy by his circumstances rather than his potential. Eggsy's intelligence is obvious, but his environment encourages him to waste it. Instead of seeing a future for himself, Eggsy appears to be drifting. This is one of the movie's most important ideas. Eggsy isn't presented as someone who lacks ability. He is presented as someone who lacks opportunity. That distinction becomes crucial later. One day, Eggsy makes a reckless decision that brings him into serious trouble. He steals a car belonging to one of Dean's friends. The decision is foolish, but it also reveals something about Eggsy. He is willing to take risks. He is resourceful. He has confidence. But without direction, those qualities can become self-destructive. Eggsy is arrested, and suddenly he finds himself facing consequences that could make his situation even worse. This is the moment when he remembers the medal Harry gave him. After 17 years, Eggsy finally uses the emergency number. And that single phone call changes everything. Harry Hart returns. Harry arrives and arranges for Eggsy's release. But he doesn't simply get Eggsy out of trouble and walk away. Harry realizes that the boy he once knew has grown into a young man who is struggling to find his place. When Harry sees the way Dean treats Eggsy, he recognizes something familiar. He understands that Eggsy's problem isn't simply bad behavior. Eggsy has potential that has never been properly developed. Harry then decides to intervene. The confrontation with Dean and his gang becomes one of the earliest demonstrations of what Harry is capable of. At first, Harry appears to be a refined gentleman. He speaks calmly. He dresses impeccably. He carries himself with the confidence of someone who has never had to prove himself. But when the situation turns violent, the polite exterior disappears. Harry reveals an astonishing level of combat skill. The sequence is important because it completely changes Eggsy's perception of him. This isn't just an old family acquaintance. Harry is something far more extraordinary. The secret behind Harry's identity. Harry eventually reveals the truth. He is a member of Kingsman, an independent secret intelligence organization operating outside traditional government structures. His codename is Galahad. Suddenly, Eggsy's world becomes much larger. The person who seemed like an ordinary gentleman is actually a highly trained secret agent. And Harry isn't merely telling Eggsy this story for entertainment. He has a proposition. Kingsman has recently lost one of its agents, Lancelot. The agent was killed while attempting to rescue climate change professor James Arnold from kidnappers. The person responsible for that death was Gazelle, a highly skilled and extremely dangerous assassin working for billionaire Richmond Valentine. Because the organization needs a replacement, Harry nominates Eggsy. This decision is not based on pity. Harry believes Eggsy possesses qualities that could make him a successful Kingsman agent. But Eggsy has to prove it. Being recruited is only the beginning. Eggsy enters the Kingsman world. Eggsy enters a completely different environment. The world he knew was chaotic, aggressive, and uncertain. Kingsman is the opposite. Everything is controlled. Everything is disciplined. The organization operates according to traditions, rules, and standards. Eggsy suddenly finds himself surrounded by candidates who appear more prepared than he is. Many come from privileged backgrounds. They have confidence, education, and social advantages. Eggsy feels like an outsider. But this is exactly what makes his journey interesting. The movie isn't asking whether Eggsy can become someone like Harry. It is asking whether Eggsy can discover what kind of agent he can become himself. His training is supervised by Merlin, the Kingsman's technical support specialist. Merlin isn't simply a trainer. He represents the technological side of the organization. While Harry embodies field experience and traditional espionage, Merlin represents intelligence, technology, planning, and logistical support. Together, these characters show that Kingsman isn't built around one individual. It is a sophisticated system. The training begins. Eggsy's training becomes one of the most entertaining sections of the movie. The candidates are subjected to difficult tests designed to measure more than physical strength. They must demonstrate courage, intelligence, teamwork, adaptability, and emotional control. The training isn't simply about teaching people how to fight. A Kingsman agent has to be able to function under pressure. They must make decisions when everything is going wrong. They have to trust their teammates. They have to overcome fear. And they must understand that intelligence can be just as important as physical power. Eggsy initially struggles because he doesn't have the same background as some of the other candidates. But he gradually proves that his lack of privilege doesn't mean a lack of ability. In fact, some of his experiences have given him strengths that the others don't possess. He knows how to survive difficult situations. He knows how to read people. And he has developed a street-smart adaptability that becomes extremely valuable. Eggsy and Roxy. Among the candidates, Eggsy develops a friendship with Roxy. Their relationship provides a refreshing contrast to the intense competition surrounding them. Instead of seeing one another purely as rivals, they begin to respect each other's abilities. Roxy is intelligent, determined, and capable. She doesn't need to be defined simply by her relationship with Eggsy. She is a serious candidate in her own right. Their friendship also reinforces one of the movie's broader themes. Becoming a Kingsman agent isn't necessarily about being the strongest person in the room. Different people possess different kinds of strengths. Roxy demonstrates this repeatedly. Eggsy does as well. By the later stages of training, the competition becomes increasingly intense. Eventually, only Eggsy and Roxy remain. That moment is significant because it proves how far Eggsy has come. The young man who initially seemed lost is now standing at the final stage of one of the world's most demanding secret agent selection processes. But then he faces a test that reveals something deeper about his character. The puppy test. Eggsy is asked to shoot a puppy that he has previously been tasked with raising. For the audience, the situation appears cruel. Eggsy has developed an attachment to the animal. He refuses. No matter how much pressure is placed on him, he cannot bring himself to pull the trigger. At first, this seems like a failure. Eggsy has reached the final stage, but he refuses to complete the task. Roxy, meanwhile, succeeds. She becomes the new Lancelot. However, there is an important twist. The gun Eggsy was given contained blanks. The puppy was never actually in danger. The test was designed to measure Eggsy's willingness to kill. Eggsy's refusal reveals something the Kingsman organization values more than blind obedience. He has compassion. He understands that following an order doesn't automatically make an action morally correct. In another movie, refusing an order might simply make a character look weak. Here, it becomes evidence of character. Eggsy may not have passed the test according to its apparent rules, but he has demonstrated that he possesses a conscience. And that quality becomes increasingly important as the story moves toward its final conflict. Meanwhile, Harry investigates James Arnold. While Eggsy is undergoing training, Harry continues investigating the mysterious kidnapping of Professor James Arnold. Arnold is a climate change expert whose disappearance initially appears to be connected to a larger conspiracy. But something about his return is suspicious. Arnold is suddenly brought back unharmed. This changes the investigation completely. The Kingsman agents now understand that they are dealing with technology far more sophisticated than an ordinary criminal operation. Someone has access to advanced methods of controlling and monitoring people. The question becomes, who? Richmond Valentine enters the investigation. The answer begins to point toward Richmond Valentine. Valentine is a billionaire philanthropist and technology entrepreneur. Publicly, he presents himself as a generous figure attempting to help the world. He has recently distributed free SIM cards on a massive scale. To ordinary people, the offer seems almost too good to be true. Free technology. Free communication. A gift from a wealthy businessman. But Harry and the Kingsman organization begin to suspect that there is something far more dangerous behind the offer. The SIM cards are not simply a charitable gesture. They are part of Valentine's larger plan. The mysterious microchips found in the necks of his associates provide another clue. The same implantation scar appears on people connected to Valentine. That means Arnold's death was not an isolated incident. It was part of something much bigger. Harry wakes up. After surviving the attack, Harry eventually recovers from his coma. But he isn't ready to step back. The danger is too serious. He needs to understand what Valentine is planning. Harry decides to investigate Valentine directly. Instead of approaching him as a Kingsman agent, Harry disguises his identity. He poses as a wealthy philanthropist. This allows him to enter Valentine's world without immediately revealing that he is investigating him. The sequence demonstrates Harry's professionalism. He doesn't simply attack the enemy. He infiltrates. He observes. He gathers information. This is the traditional spycraft side of the movie. Beneath all the spectacular action, Kingsman still understands that espionage depends heavily on intelligence and deception. Harry gradually uncovers more evidence linking Valentine to the mysterious chips and the global network he is building. But the investigation also leads him toward one of the most disturbing locations in the film. The Kentucky Church. Harry's investigation eventually takes him to Kentucky. There, he discovers a connection between Valentine and a religious hate group. The discovery is alarming because it demonstrates that Valentine's influence extends far beyond wealthy social circles and technology companies. He has connections to dangerous groups willing to participate in his plan. Harry enters the church to investigate. What follows is one of the movie's most infamous and controversial action sequences. Valentine activates a signal through the SIM card technology. The signal causes the people inside the church to become uncontrollably violent. Suddenly, a place associated with faith and community transforms into an environment of complete chaos. Harry is surrounded. He has to fight for his survival. Harry's extraordinary fight. The church sequence showcases everything that makes Kingsman different from traditional spy cinema. Harry doesn't fight like an ordinary action hero. His movements are precise, controlled, and incredibly fast. The camera moves with him, creating the feeling that the audience is trapped inside the chaos alongside him. He uses the environment. He reacts to attacks. He moves from one opponent to another. The sequence becomes almost like a piece of choreographed dance, except the stakes are extremely high. Harry is ultimately the sole survivor. The scene demonstrates just how dangerous and skilled he is. But it also raises an important question. If Harry is this capable, how can anyone stop him? The answer comes almost immediately. Valentine's final move against Harry. Harry survives the church massacre, but he doesn't get to walk away. Valentine personally confronts him. The meeting between the two men represents the collision between traditional espionage and modern technology. Harry represents the old world. He is disciplined, experienced, and guided by a personal code. Valentine represents a new kind of threat. He possesses enormous financial resources, advanced technology, global influence, and an ideology that allows him to justify extreme actions. Despite Harry's skills, Valentine ultimately gains the advantage. He shoots Harry. The moment is devastating because Harry has become more than a mentor to Eggsy. He is the person who gave Eggsy a second chance. He is the person who recognized Eggsy's potential. He is also connected to Eggsy's father, whose sacrifice started this entire story. Harry's apparent death therefore carries enormous emotional weight. It threatens to destroy the person who helped Eggsy discover a new future. Why this section matters to the overall story. Everything that happens in this part of Kingsman, the Secret Service serves a larger purpose. Eggsy's personal journey is developing at the same time that Valentine's global conspiracy is becoming more dangerous. The two stories initially appear separate. Eggsy is learning how to become a spy. Harry is investigating a mysterious billionaire. But eventually, the two paths will collide. The training sequences show Eggsy becoming capable. Harry's investigation reveals the scale of the threat. Valentine's actions demonstrate why the Kingsman organization is necessary. And Harry's fate creates the emotional motivation Eggsy will need later. The movie is essentially preparing Eggsy to inherit responsibility. At the beginning, Eggsy is a young man who cannot control his circumstances. By this point, he has become someone capable of making difficult decisions. That transformation is the heart of the story. Eggsy's real test. The puppy test initially makes Eggsy believe that he isn't good enough to become a Kingsman agent. But the truth is very different. His refusal to kill the animal demonstrates that he has something important. He has empathy. He has moral boundaries. He understands that being powerful doesn't mean abandoning compassion. This becomes especially meaningful because Valentine believes he can solve humanity's problems through control. Valentine views people as a problem to be managed. Eggsy's journey suggests the opposite. Human beings cannot simply be reduced to numbers, threats, or obstacles. They have choices. They have emotions. They have relationships. Eggsy's humanity becomes one of his greatest strengths. A new generation of Kingsman. The contrast between Harry and Eggsy is also central to the movie. Harry represents the traditional Kingsman. Eggsy represents the future. Harry has years of experience and understands the rules. Eggsy challenges those rules. Harry is sophisticated. Eggsy is rough around the edges. Harry comes from an established world of privilege and tradition. Eggsy has had to survive without either. Yet Harry sees something in Eggsy that makes him worthy. That is why his mentorship matters. Harry isn't simply training a replacement. He is helping create the next generation. And when Harry is removed from the story, Eggsy is forced to stand on his own. The film's balance of comedy and seriousness. One of the most distinctive characteristics of this story is its ability to mix serious themes with comedy. The film can discuss global catastrophe and then suddenly introduce an absurd joke. It can show sophisticated espionage and then completely undermine the seriousness with exaggerated humor. Some audiences love this approach. Others find it excessive. But it is undeniably part of the movie's identity. The filmmakers aren't trying to create a realistic spy thriller. They are creating a heightened comic book world where absurdity and danger can exist together. That is why Valentine's personality works. That is why the gadgets work. That is why Harry can deliver a polite sentence before launching into an astonishing fight. And that is why X's transformation feels like something larger than reality. Final perspective. The journey from Lee Unwin's sacrifice to Harry's confrontation with Valentine creates the emotional foundation of Kingsman, the Secret Service. Lee sacrifices himself in 1997, unknowingly shaping the future of his son. Harry carries the guilt of that sacrifice for 17 years. Eggsy grows up without fully understanding the world his father once belonged to. Then one reckless night brings Harry back into his life. A simple emergency number becomes the key that opens the door to Kingsman. Eggsy enters a world of secret agents, advanced technology, brutal training, and extraordinary danger. He discovers that he has abilities he never knew how to use. He forms a friendship with Roxy. He survives increasingly difficult tests. He reaches the final stage. And although he appears to fail when he refuses to shoot his puppy, that failure actually reveals his greatest strength, his humanity. Meanwhile, Harry follows the clues surrounding Professor James Arnold and discovers that Richmond Valentine is preparing something far more dangerous than an ordinary criminal scheme. The microchip in Arnold's neck, Valentine's SIM cards, the mysterious scars on his associates, and his connection to the Kentucky church all begin to reveal the scope of the conspiracy. Harry confronts the threat directly. He enters the church. He survives an extraordinary battle. But then Valentine personally shoots him. At this moment, X's journey reaches a crucial turning point. The mentor who opened the door for him is seemingly gone. The man who believed in his potential can no longer guide him. Now Eggsy must decide what kind of person he wants to become. That is what makes this section of Kingsman, the Secret Service, so important. It isn't simply about secret agents and villains. It is about a young man discovering that his circumstances do not define him. It is about a mentor recognizing potential where everyone else sees failure. It is about the tension between tradition and change. And it is about the question of whether power should be used to control people or to protect them. The movie wraps all of these ideas inside a fast-moving spy adventure filled with humor, technology, action, and spectacle. But beneath the stylish suits and spectacular fights, X's story remains surprisingly human. A boy loses his father. A man carries guilt for 17 years. A troubled young man receives one unexpected opportunity. And that opportunity transforms his entire understanding of himself. By the time Harry faces Valentine, Eggsy is no longer simply the reckless young man who stole a car. He has entered a world where every decision has consequences. And although he still has much to learn, the foundations of the future Kingsman agent have already been established. The greatest lesson Harry gives Eggsy is not how to fight. It is the belief that a person's background does not determine their destiny. Sometimes, all someone needs is one person willing to see their potential. For Eggsy, that person was Harry Hart. And that makes Harry's sacrifice far more meaningful than simply another dramatic moment in a spy movie. After everything Eggsy has endured, the final act of Kingsman, the Secret Service transforms his personal journey into a race against time to save the entire world. What began as the story of a troubled young man trying to escape a difficult home life now becomes a massive global crisis involving a billionaire's plan, hidden technology, world leaders, secret agents, and a horrifying attempt to manipulate humanity on an unprecedented scale. But the most important part of this climax is not simply whether Eggsy can stop Richmond Valentine. It is whether Eggsy can finally become the kind of Kingsman agent Harry Hart believed he could be. Harry is gone. The old generation of Kingsman agents has been shaken. Valentine's plan is almost ready. And Eggsy has to step forward. The shocking discovery at Kingsman headquarters. After Harry's apparent death, Eggsy returns to Kingsman headquarters. At this point, he has every reason to believe that the organization is still fighting an unknown enemy. But then he discovers something that changes his understanding of the entire conspiracy. The leader of Kingsman, Chester Arthur King, has a scar on his neck. It is the same type of scar discovered on Richmond Valentine's associates. That means Arthur has been implanted with the same kind of technology. For Eggsy, the revelation is shocking. The person leading the organization that exists to protect the world has secretly been connected to the very technology being used by its greatest enemy. This creates an atmosphere of paranoia. Who can be trusted? How many people have been compromised? And how close is Valentine to achieving his goal? Arthur eventually reveals the truth. Valentine isn't simply planning an attack against a government or a specific country. His plan is global. He intends to use the SIM card technology to manipulate human behavior on an enormous scale. The objective is to trigger widespread violence and drastically reduce the world's population. Valentine believes that humanity is destroying the planet. His solution is horrifyingly simple in its logic: if there are fewer humans, there will be less pressure on the environment. From his perspective, he is solving climate change. But the movie deliberately presents this idea as an extreme and morally horrifying form of population control. Valentine's twisted philosophy. This is what makes Valentine more interesting than a villain who simply wants money or political power. He genuinely believes he is doing something necessary. His motivation is connected to a real-world concern: environmental destruction and climate change. But his response to that problem is completely radical. Instead of encouraging humanity to change its behavior, he wants to manipulate humanity through technology. Instead of persuading people, he wants to remove their ability to choose. And instead of accepting the complexity of the problem, he reduces humanity itself to the problem. This creates one of the movie's most important moral conflicts. Valentine believes that the ends justify the means. Eggsy and the Kingsman organization represent the opposite idea. Human life cannot simply be treated as a statistic. People have individual value. They have families. They have relationships. They have the right to make their own decisions. The movie therefore turns its final battle into more than a fight between heroes and villains. It becomes a conflict between freedom and control. The protected elite. Valentine's plan contains another disturbing detail. Not everyone is going to be affected by the signal. Some of the world's wealthiest and most powerful individuals have already been implanted with protective chips. Selected world leaders and wealthy supporters are therefore protected. This exposes another contradiction in Valentine's ideology. He claims he wants to save the planet. But he isn't willing to sacrifice himself. He is willing to decide which people deserve protection and which people do not. The plan therefore isn't simply about environmentalism. It is about control. Valentine has effectively created a hierarchy in which certain people are considered valuable enough to survive while millions of ordinary people are treated as expendable. That hypocrisy becomes one of the strongest reasons why his plan must be stopped. The prisoners in Valentine's bunker. The people who refuse to cooperate with Valentine are treated differently. Among those imprisoned is Crown Princess Tilda of Sweden. She represents the political leaders who refuse to accept Valentine's vision. The bunker becomes a symbol of Valentine's power. It is not merely a physical location where people are being held. It represents his attempt to create a controlled version of society. Those who agree with him receive protection. Those who resist are imprisoned. And everyone else is placed in danger. The deeper Eggsy travels into Valentine's world, the more obvious it becomes that stopping the signal is the only way to prevent catastrophe. Eggsy takes control of the situation. Arthur has now become a serious obstacle. Eggsy realizes that he cannot simply attack him. He needs to find a way to neutralize the threat. This leads to one of the movie's darkest moments. Eggsy manipulates Arthur into poisoning himself. The sequence demonstrates that Eggsy has changed. Earlier in the movie, he was impulsive and emotional. Now he is capable of deception and strategic thinking. He understands that being a spy isn't only about physical strength. Sometimes the most effective weapon is intelligence. Arthur's downfall also marks the end of the old leadership. The Kingsman organization has been compromised from within. Now the younger generation has to take responsibility. Eggsy joins forces with Merlin and Roxy. Together, they prepare for the final mission. The three-part plan. The heroes now divide their responsibilities. Roxy will attack Valentine's satellite network. Eggsy will infiltrate Valentine's bunker. Merlin will assist with the technology and search for a way to counteract the signal. Each character contributes something different. Roxy represents the precision and technical capability of Kingsman. Merlin represents intelligence and technological expertise. Eggsy represents adaptability and field combat. The mission is therefore a true team effort. This is important because Eggsy doesn't suddenly become a superhero who can solve everything alone. He needs his allies. That reflects one of the core ideas of the Kingsman organization. Even the most talented agent depends on the people behind the mission. Roxy's mission in space. Roxy receives one of the most extraordinary assignments in the movie. She has to destroy one of Valentine's satellites. The mission takes her beyond the normal boundaries of espionage. Instead of sneaking through a building or fighting armed guards, Roxy is sent into space. The sequence emphasizes just how enormous Valentine's operation has become. This isn't a local criminal conspiracy. It is a technological network with global consequences. Roxy succeeds in destroying the satellite. For a moment, it appears that Valentine's plan has been stopped. But the victory doesn't last. Valentine has anticipated the possibility of losing a satellite. He has another one ready. This detail is important because it demonstrates the scale of his preparation. The Kingsman team may be brilliant, but Valentine has spent enormous resources preparing for resistance. Eggsy disguises himself as Arthur. Meanwhile, Eggsy develops another part of the plan. He disguises himself as Arthur. This allows him to infiltrate Valentine's bunker without immediately revealing his true identity. The disguise is more than a simple joke. It demonstrates Eggsy's growing confidence. He is now capable of entering enemy territory and pretending to be someone else. Earlier, Eggsy was struggling to fit into the Kingsman world. Now he is using the organization's traditions and methods to deceive one of the most dangerous enemies on the planet. His transformation is becoming complete. But the infiltration doesn't go perfectly. Charlie Hesketh returns. Eggsy's cover is eventually threatened by Charlie Hesketh, another former Kingsman recruit. Charlie had previously competed against Eggsy during the training process. Unlike Eggsy, Charlie represents someone who failed to adapt to the demands of Kingsman. His return is therefore significant. Eggsy and Charlie started from similar positions. Both were candidates. Both wanted to become Kingsman agents. But their paths went in different directions. Eggsy learned humility, teamwork, and adaptability. Charlie became an enemy. This confrontation allows the movie to show how different choices can lead two people toward completely different futures. Eggsy's past has literally come back to confront him. Valentine launches the signal. Despite the hero's efforts, Valentine manages to secure a replacement satellite. The plan is back on schedule. He activates the signal. And suddenly, the entire world begins to change. People who have received the SIM cards become affected. The technology triggers uncontrollable aggression. Ordinary people begin attacking one another. The world descends into chaos. This is exactly what Valentine wanted. For him, the violence is not an unexpected consequence. It is the plan. The signal is designed to turn humanity against itself. The movie now moves from a spy thriller into a global catastrophe. The world descends into chaos. The final act creates a powerful contrast between the elegant Kingsman world and the disorder spreading across the planet. People who would normally live peaceful lives become violent. Governments lose control. Cities descend into panic. Families are threatened. The world begins destroying itself. And Valentine watches the chaos unfold. His belief is that once the population is drastically reduced, the survivors will have a chance to rebuild. But this is the ultimate flaw in his thinking. He has convinced himself that because he believes the goal is important, any method is acceptable. The movie rejects that philosophy. Saving the planet by destroying humanity is not presented as a solution. It is presented as another form of destruction. Eggsy faces Gazelle. Inside Valentine's operation, Eggsy comes face to face with Gazelle. Gazelle is one of the most dangerous characters in the film. She was responsible for killing the previous Lancelot. She is also Valentine's most formidable enforcer. Her prosthetic legs are not merely a physical adaptation. They have been transformed into weapons. This makes her a perfect representation of the Kingsman world. Elegance and danger exist together. Gazelle moves with extraordinary speed. Her fighting style is unpredictable. And Eggsy knows that defeating her will require everything he has learned. The confrontation becomes one of the most important physical tests of Eggsy's transformation. Eggsy's final fight. The fight between Eggsy and Gazelle is fast, aggressive, and highly stylized. But what makes it meaningful is the history behind it. Gazelle represents the threat that originally destroyed the Kingsman team's previous generation. Eggsy represents the new generation. This is therefore more than a simple fight. It is a symbolic passing of the torch. The assassin who helped create the vacancy Eggsy was recruited to fill is now standing directly in front of him. Eggsy survives the confrontation. He ultimately kills Gazelle using one of her own prosthetic blades. This is a fitting conclusion to their conflict. The weapon that made Gazelle such a terrifying enemy becomes the tool that ends her threat. Eggsy has defeated one of Valentine's most powerful allies. But the larger mission is still unfinished. The signal remains active. Merlin's counterattack. While Eggsy is fighting inside the bunker, Merlin is working on a completely different part of the mission. He discovers that the implanted chips can be manipulated. This gives the Kingsman team a potential solution. Instead of trying to stop the signal everywhere, Merlin can activate a failsafe within the implanted devices. The consequences are spectacular. The protective chips implanted in Valentine's allies suddenly become weapons against them. The people who believed they were protected are no longer safe. Merlin activates the failsafe. The heads of Valentine's protected allies explode. The scene is deliberately exaggerated and absurd, fitting the movie's comic book tone. But narratively, it is important. Valentine's greatest advantage has become his weakness. The very technology he believed would protect his supporters becomes the mechanism that destroys them. The collapse of Valentine's plan. With his allies eliminated and the signal disrupted, Valentine's carefully constructed plan begins to fall apart. For someone who believed he had planned for every possible outcome, this is the ultimate failure. He believed technology made him superior. He believed money made him untouchable. He believed his ideology justified everything he did. But he underestimated the people standing against him. He underestimated Eggsy. And he underestimated the Kingsman organization. Eggsy confronts Valentine. The final confrontation between Eggsy and Valentine brings the entire story together. Eggsy has gone from a troubled young man with no clear future to a trained Kingsman operative capable of confronting a billionaire responsible for a global catastrophe. Valentine still believes his plan is necessary. But Eggsy understands something Valentine doesn't. Human beings cannot be saved by destroying their freedom. The conflict is therefore personal and ideological at the same time. Eggsy isn't simply trying to survive. He is trying to prevent Valentine from deciding the fate of billions of people. Eventually, Eggsy uses one of Gazelle's prosthetic blades to kill Valentine. The villain's plan ends. The signal is stopped. The immediate threat to humanity is defeated. Eggsy becomes the new Galahad. The ending is not simply about defeating Valentine. It is about Eggsy completing his transformation. Harry Hart was known as Galahad. He was the mentor who first recognized Eggsy's potential. Now Eggsy takes on the Galahad identity. This represents more than receiving a new codename. It means Eggsy has earned a place within the organization. He is no longer simply a recruit. He has become a Kingsman agent. The transformation that began with one emergency telephone number has finally reached its conclusion. The mid-credits scene. The mid-credit sequence provides a humorous but meaningful epilogue. Eggsy returns to the people from his old life. But he is no longer the same person. He offers his mother and younger half-sister a new home. This moment demonstrates that Eggsy hasn't forgotten where he came from. His success hasn't made him ashamed of his past. Instead, he uses his new position to protect the people he loves. That is an important distinction. Eggsy doesn't become a Kingsman agent by abandoning his family. He becomes one while maintaining his connection to them. Eggsy confronts Dean. Eggsy also confronts Dean and his gang. This is particularly satisfying because Dean represents everything Eggsy has been trying to escape. At the beginning of the movie, Dean had power over him. Eggsy was trapped in a situation where he had little control. Now the balance has changed. Eggsy possesses confidence, skills, resources, and a completely different understanding of himself. But the most important difference is psychological. Eggsy no longer believes Dean defines him. He has discovered his own value. The confrontation therefore becomes a final reminder of how far the character has traveled. The meaning of Eggsy's transformation. Eggsy's journey is the emotional backbone of the entire movie. At the beginning, he is talented but directionless. He has intelligence but no clear future. He has courage but often uses it recklessly. Harry recognizes that these qualities can be transformed. Through training, Eggsy learns discipline. Through competition, he learns teamwork. Through failure, he learns humility. Through Harry's mentorship, he learns responsibility. And through Valentine's attack, he learns what it means to protect others. By the end, Eggsy is no longer trying to prove himself to people like Dean. He is trying to become the person Harry believed he could be. The importance of Roxy. Roxy's role is also significant. She proves that the Kingsman organization isn't simply about Eggsy. She succeeds where Eggsy initially fails and becomes the new Lancelot. Her satellite mission demonstrates that she is every bit as capable as the other agents. This adds another layer to the film's message about ability. Kingsman agents aren't selected simply because of their background. They are selected because of what they can contribute. Roxy's success reinforces that idea. Merlin's importance. Merlin is another essential part of the final victory. Without his technological expertise, Eggsy's mission would not have succeeded. His work with the implanted chips ultimately provides the solution that defeats Valentine's protected network. This highlights an important truth about espionage. The field agent may receive the glory, but missions are often won through teamwork. Eggsy fights. Roxy handles the satellite. Merlin handles the technology. Each person is essential. Valentine's defeat as a moral victory. Valentine's defeat represents more than the death of a villain. It represents the rejection of his worldview. He believes humanity is the disease. The Kingsman agents demonstrate that humanity is also capable of courage, loyalty, friendship, sacrifice, and compassion. Harry sacrificed himself for Lee. Lee sacrificed himself to protect Harry. Harry later protects Eggsy. Eggsy risks himself to save millions of people. These sacrifices undermine Valentine's argument. Humanity may be flawed. It may make terrible mistakes. But that doesn't mean human life has no value. The movie's heroes fight not because humanity is perfect, but because people are worth protecting despite their imperfections. The full circle of the story. The ending creates a satisfying circle. The story begins with Lee sacrificing himself. That sacrifice changes Harry. Harry later becomes the person who gives Eggsy a chance. Eggsy enters Kingsman. Harry is seemingly killed. Eggsy continues the mission. Eggsy defeats Valentine's organization. And finally, Eggsy becomes Galahad. The responsibility has passed from one generation to another. That makes the ending emotionally stronger than simply defeating a villain. The movie is about legacy. Lee's legacy lives through Harry. Harry's legacy lives through Eggsy. And Eggsy now has the opportunity to shape the future of Kingsman himself. Final analysis. The final act of Kingsman, the Secret Service succeeds because it combines the personal and the global. On one level, Eggsy is fighting to save humanity from Valentine's plan. On another level, he is fighting to prove that Harry's faith in him was justified. The global stakes provide the spectacle. Eggsy's personal journey provides the emotional reason to care. Valentine's plan is enormous. The satellite network is enormous. The worldwide signal is enormous. But the heart of the story remains one young man trying to become something better than what his circumstances predicted. Valentine believes the world can be fixed by eliminating people. Eggsy's story suggests that the world can be improved by giving people opportunities. Valentine uses technology to remove choice. Eggsy uses his training to protect choice. Valentine surrounds himself with wealth and power. Eggsy surrounds himself with friends and allies. And that contrast ultimately determines who wins. By the time the credits roll, Eggsy has completed one of the most dramatic transformations in the movie. He begins as a reckless young man who believes his future is limited. He ends as a confident Kingsman agent carrying the legacy of Harry Hart. His mother and younger sister receive the opportunity to live somewhere better. Dean no longer controls his life. Roxy has become Lancelot. Merlin remains an essential member of the organization. And Valentine, Gazelle, and the conspiracy that threatened the world have been defeated. The final message is surprisingly simple beneath all the explosions and comic book spectacle. A person's circumstances do not have to determine their destiny. Eggsy wasn't born into the perfect environment. He wasn't handed an elite education. He wasn't raised knowing he would become a secret agent. He was simply given one opportunity. Harry believed in him. And Eggsy decided to believe in himself. That is ultimately why the ending of Kingsman, the Secret Service, feels satisfying. Samuel L. Jackson gives the film one of its most memorable performances as Richmond Valentine. The character is a billionaire technology entrepreneur who believes he has discovered a solution to humanity's environmental problems. But Valentine is unlike most traditional movie villains. He isn't constantly shouting. He isn't presented as an emotionless monster. He is eccentric. He is playful. He can be strangely charming. He has an unusual fear of blood. Jackson uses these characteristics to create a villain who can be simultaneously funny and disturbing. Valentine's behavior often seems almost childish. But his ideas are horrifying. That contrast makes him unpredictable. The audience never quite knows whether he is going to make a joke, reveal another part of his plan, or do something genuinely terrifying. Jackson also understands that Valentine shouldn't feel like a completely serious villain. The movie itself is exaggerated, so the antagonist needs to fit that world. Jackson's performance provides exactly that balance. Valentine's philosophy. The most interesting aspect of Jackson's performance is that he doesn't play Valentine as someone who believes he is evil. Valentine thinks he is right. He believes humanity is destroying the planet. He believes drastic action is necessary. He sees himself as someone willing to make difficult decisions that others are too afraid to make. Jackson communicates that conviction without turning Valentine into a traditional ideological speaker. His casual personality makes the character more unsettling. He can discuss enormous global consequences while behaving as though he is simply discussing a business decision. That emotional distance reflects Valentine's worldview. Human beings have become numbers. The environment has become a problem. And Valentine believes he can solve everything with technology. Mark Strong as Merlin. Mark Strong plays Hamish Mycroft, better known as Merlin. If Harry is the field operative and Eggsy is the emerging young agent, Merlin represents the technological and strategic backbone of Kingsman. Strong gives Merlin a calm, authoritative presence. He doesn't need to dominate every scene. Instead, his performance creates the impression that Merlin always knows more than he is saying. This makes him an ideal support character. Merlin isn't simply the person who provides gadgets. He is a planner. He understands technology. He monitors missions. He helps guide the agents. And during the final confrontation, his knowledge becomes critical to defeating Valentine's plan. Strong also contributes to the movie's humor. Merlin's dry reactions help balance the more exaggerated personalities around him. He often appears like the one person in the room who understands how absurd everything has become. That makes him an important tonal anchor. Sophie Cookson as Roxanne "Roxy" Morton and Lancelot. Sophie Cookson plays Roxanne "Roxy" Morton, one of the Kingsman candidates. Roxy is particularly important because she demonstrates that Eggsy isn't the only recruit with potential. She is intelligent, capable, disciplined, and determined. Cookson plays her with confidence without making her unnecessarily aggressive. Her friendship with Eggsy develops naturally. They are competitors, but they also respect one another. That relationship makes the training sequences more interesting because the movie avoids reducing every candidate to a simple rival. Roxy eventually succeeds in becoming the new Lancelot. Her achievement is important to the story because Eggsy initially appears to fail the final test. The movie therefore demonstrates that there are multiple paths to becoming a successful Kingsman agent. Roxy's later satellite mission further proves her ability. She is trusted with a critical part of the global operation, and she successfully destroys one of Valentine's satellites. Cookson's performance gives Roxy a sense of competence that makes the character's success believable. Jack Davenport as James Spencer a Lancelot. Jack Davenport appears as James Spencer, the Kingsman agent known as Lancelot. Although his screen time is relatively limited, the character serves an important narrative purpose. His death establishes the seriousness of Valentine's threat. Lancelot is killed by Gazelle while attempting to rescue Professor James Arnold. This event creates the vacancy that eventually leads to Eggsy's recruitment. In other words, Spencer's character becomes part of the chain of events that brings Eggsy into Kingsman. His role demonstrates that being a Kingsman agent isn't a glamorous game. Real people die. Missions can fail. And every position within the organization carries enormous responsibility. Mark Hamill as Professor James Arnold. Mark Hamill plays Professor James Arnold. For many viewers, Hamill's presence is particularly interesting because of his iconic career. Here, he appears in a much smaller dramatic role. Professor Arnold is a climate change expert whose kidnapping becomes one of the earliest clues in the investigation into Valentine's activities. His apparent return creates suspicion. When Harry attempts to question him, the microchip implanted in Arnold's neck activates and kills him. Although Arnold doesn't remain in the story for long, his character is extremely important to the plot. His death provides the Kingsman organization with evidence that a sophisticated conspiracy is underway. Hamill's performance helps make the character feel like a credible academic figure whose unexpected connection to the conspiracy raises the stakes. Sofia Boutella as Gazelle. Sofia Boutella's Gazelle is one of the most visually distinctive characters in the film. Gazelle is Valentine's elite enforcer and one of the most dangerous physical threats Eggsy faces. Her prosthetic legs are transformed into weapons, making her fighting style unlike that of conventional action villains. Boutella's physical performance is particularly important. Gazelle communicates through movement as much as dialogue. Her confidence, speed, and precision create a sense of danger whenever she appears. The characters are connected by the film's central themes. Harry represents tradition. Eggsy represents transformation. Merlin represents knowledge and technology. Roxy represents a new generation of talent. Arthur represents established authority. Valentine represents technological power without moral restraint. Gazelle represents physical danger. Charlie represents failure without humility. Lee represents sacrifice. Together, these characters create a larger picture of what the film is trying to say. The contrast between actors and characters. The casting also works because many actors bring qualities that contrast with their previous screen identities. Colin Firth, traditionally associated with refined dramatic roles, becomes an action hero. Michael Caine brings his classic authority to a character who is eventually revealed to be compromised. Samuel L. Jackson takes the familiar image of the intimidating villain and turns it into something eccentric and comedic. Taron Egerton, then a relatively young performer, becomes the emotional center of a large-scale action movie. Sofia Boutella turns movement and physical performance into a major part of Gazelle's characterization. This combination gives the movie its distinctive personality. Why the cast matters to the film's success. The performances are essential because Kingsman is a movie of contrasts. It needs actors who can play the material seriously while understanding that the film is intentionally exaggerated. The cast succeeds because the characters never seem completely aware that they are inside a parody. Harry genuinely believes in manners. Valentine genuinely believes he is saving humanity. Exie genuinely wants to prove himself. Merlin genuinely wants to protect the organization. That sincerity allows the comedy to work. If everyone treated the movie as a joke, the emotional moments would have no impact. Instead, the actors commit to their characters. That commitment creates the strange but effective balance between humor and seriousness. Final assessment of the cast. The cast of Kingsman, The Secret Service, is one of the film's greatest assets. Colin Firth gives Harry heart elegance, authority, humor, and emotional depth. Taron Egerton gives Exie vulnerability, charisma, determination, and a believable transformation. Samuel L. Jackson creates a villain who is eccentric enough to be entertaining but dangerous enough to remain threatening. Mark Strong provides Merlin with intelligence and controlled humor. Sophie Cookson makes Roxy a capable and memorable member of the new generation. Sofia Boutella turns Gazelle into one of the film's most visually recognizable antagonists. Michael Caine gives Arthur the authority expected from the leader of Kingsman while making his betrayal particularly significant. The supporting cast fills the world with enough characters to make the Kingsman organization and Valentine's conspiracy feel larger than the central heroes and villains. Ultimately, the casting works because every major performer contributes to the movie's unusual identity. This isn't a conventional spy film. It isn't a conventional comedy. It isn't a straightforward superhero story. It is a stylish mixture of all three. And the cast understands that balance. At the center of everything is Exie. His journey from a troubled young man to a confident Kingsman agent gives the movie its emotional structure. But that journey would not work without Harry's mentorship, Valentine's threat, Merlin's support, Roxy's partnership, Gazelle's physical danger, Arthur's authority, and the many supporting characters who shape Exie's path. The film ultimately succeeds because its actors make an absurd world feel emotionally convincing. The suits may be exaggerated. The gadgets may be outrageous. The action may be spectacular. The villain's plan may be deliberately extreme. But the emotions underneath the spectacle, loss, loyalty, ambition, family, mentorship, sacrifice, and the desire to become something better, are recognizable. That is what makes the performances memorable. Kingsman, The Secret Service may be famous for its action sequences and outrageous spy gadgets, but its cast is what gives that spectacle a human face. Before Kingsman, The Secret Service became one of the most recognizable modern spy action franchises. It began with a simple creative frustration, the feeling that contemporary spy movies had become too serious. The modern espionage genre had increasingly leaned toward realism, darker storytelling, political tension, and grounded action. Those approaches could be effective, but writer Mark Miller and director Matthew Vaughn wanted to explore something different. They wanted a spy movie that could be exciting without constantly taking itself seriously. They wanted elegance and absurdity. They wanted sophisticated secret agents alongside outrageous action. And most importantly, they wanted to have fun. That idea became the foundation of Kingsman, The Secret Service. What makes the production story particularly interesting is that Matthew Vaughn had another major opportunity in front of him at the same time. He had been involved with the X-Men franchise and had the opportunity to direct X-Men, Days of Future Past. Choosing between another major superhero installment and an original spy project was therefore not an easy decision. Vaughn ultimately chose Kingsman. It was a risky decision, but it allowed him to pursue a film with a distinctive identity rather than simply continuing an existing franchise. The original idea, make spy movies fun again. Development on Kingsman, The Secret Service began around January 2012, when Mark Miller and Matthew Vaughn discussed what they saw as an increasingly serious approach to spy cinema. Their basic idea was surprisingly straightforward. They wanted to make a fun spy movie. That sounds simple, but it represented a deliberate creative choice. Spy films have historically contained many different tones. Some are serious political thrillers. Some are action adventures. Some are comedies. Some combine all three. Vaughn and Miller believed there was room for a movie that celebrated the classic spy genre while also making fun of its familiar conventions. Instead of rejecting the traditional spy movie, they wanted to exaggerate it. The elegant suits. The secret headquarters. The mysterious gadgets. The wealthy villains. The beautiful locations. The code names. the sophisticated agents. All of these elements could be retained, but they could also be pushed into comic book territory. That became the creative DNA of Kingsman. Matthew Vaughn's difficult decision. One of the most significant moments in the film's development was Vaughn's decision to step away from directing X-Men, Days of Future Past. This was not an insignificant project. The X-Men franchise was already a major Hollywood property, and another installment offered Vaughn the opportunity to direct a large-scale superhero production with established characters and an existing international audience. Instead, Vaughn chose Kingsman. He later described the decision as extremely difficult. The reason was not that he disliked the X-Men franchise. Rather, he feared that if he abandoned Kingsman, another filmmaker might eventually create the kind of fun spy movie he had been imagining. That possibility concerned him because he had already invested creative energy into the screenplay. If someone else made a similar film before Vaughn could bring his own version to the screen, the screenplay might never have been produced. In other words, Vaughn was protecting the uniqueness of the project. He believed the concept needed to be made while the idea still felt fresh. That decision would eventually prove important. Why originality was so important? One of the biggest challenges facing Kingsman, the Secret Service, was that the spy genre already had enormous competition. The world had James Bond. It had numerous television spy series. It had action franchises built around highly trained agents. It had espionage thrillers emphasizing realism. So how could another spy movie stand out? The answer was style. Vaughn wasn't interested in making a movie that simply copied James Bond. Instead, he wanted to create something that understood the history of spy cinema well enough to play with it. The film could reference the traditional gentleman spy while introducing a younger protagonist from a completely different social background. It could celebrate old-school tailoring while embracing modern technology. It could create sophisticated environments and then fill them with deliberately exaggerated action. That combination became one of the film's defining qualities. The influence of James Bond. James Bond was an obvious influence on the project. The Bond films established many of the conventions audiences now associate with spy cinema. The elegant hero. The expensive suits. The sophisticated gadgets. The exotic locations. The glamorous social environments. The powerful villain. The world-threatening scheme. Vaughn and the filmmakers were aware of this history. But rather than simply imitate Bond, they wanted to examine the conventions of the genre. One of the more unusual creative choices came from Vaughn's observation about the treatment of sexual humor in Bond movies. He felt that sexual innuendo in those films frequently came from the male perspective. That observation influenced his approach to one of Kingsman's more controversial moments involving Princess Tilda. The filmmakers attempted to reverse the expected dynamic by having a female character openly express sexual interest. The intention was to play with the conventions of the traditional spy genre and its treatment of sexuality. However, the scene generated significant criticism when the film was released. Some critics interpreted it as unnecessarily crude or misogynistic rather than as satire. The controversy illustrates one of the risks of Vaughn's approach. When a film deliberately pushes genre conventions to extremes, audiences may interpret the joke very differently from the filmmaker's intentions. An alternate version was considered. The production history becomes particularly interesting because an alternate version of the movie was filmed. This version removed the controversial sexual material and other references connected to it. The existence of an alternate cut demonstrates that the filmmakers were aware of the possibility that the scene could affect the movie's reception. Ultimately, the released version retained the material. For a YouTube analysis, this production detail is important because it shows that the controversial moment wasn't simply an accidental part of the finished film. It emerged from a deliberate attempt to challenge established spy film conventions. At the same time, the reaction to it demonstrates the difficulty of mixing parody with material that some audiences may find uncomfortable. Mark Millar's contribution. Mark Millar played a central role in the project's development. Millar was already known for comic book storytelling that often combined traditional heroic concepts with exaggerated violence, humor, and unconventional characters. His approach was particularly suited to the kind of spy story Vaughn wanted to create. The source material, The Secret Service, provided the foundation for the cinematic adaptation. But the film wasn't simply a literal transfer of the comic to the screen. The filmmakers had to determine which ideas would work in a feature film and how to create a coherent cinematic world. The result was a movie that maintained the comic's irreverent spirit while developing its own visual and emotional identity. Matthew Vaughn's creative philosophy. Vaughn's approach to filmmaking is especially important when discussing the production of Kingsman. He has frequently demonstrated an interest in genre movies that can be entertaining without being conventional. His earlier work had already shown an ability to combine comedy, action, stylization, and unusual characters. With Kingsman, he had an opportunity to take that philosophy further. Instead of making the movie feel like a realistic intelligence thriller, he created a heightened universe. In this world, secret agents can wear custom-made suits that function as protective equipment. Ordinary objects can become advanced weapons. A gentleman can enter a violent confrontation without losing his composure. And a billionaire can attempt to solve a global environmental crisis through an absurdly extreme technological plan. The production therefore required a filmmaking style that could support this exaggeration, balancing comedy and action. One of the greatest production challenges was tonal balance. If the movie became too comedic, the characters might stop feeling believable. The wealthy villains, the beautiful locations, the code names, the sophisticated agents. All of these elements could be retained, but they could also be pushed into comic book territory. That became the creative DNA of Kingsman. Matthew Vaughn's difficult decision. One of the most significant moments in the film's development was Vaughn's decision to step away from directing X-Men, Days of Future Past. This was not an insignificant project. The X-Men franchise was already a major Hollywood property, and another installment offered Vaughn the opportunity to direct a large-scale superhero production with established characters and an existing international audience. Instead, Vaughn chose Kingsman. He later described the decision as extremely difficult. The reason was not that he disliked the X-Men franchise. Rather, he feared that if he abandoned Kingsman, another filmmaker might eventually create the kind of fun spy movie he had been imagining. That possibility concerned him because he had already invested creative energy into the screenplay. If someone else made a similar film before Vaughn could bring his own version to the screenplay might never have been produced. In other words, Vaughn was protecting the uniqueness of the project. He believed the concept needed to be made while the idea still felt fresh. That decision would eventually prove important. Why originality was so important? One of the biggest challenges facing Kingsman, the Secret Service, was that the spy genre already had enormous competition. The world had James Bond. It had numerous television spy series. It had action franchises built around highly trained agents. It had espionage thrillers emphasizing realism. So how could another spy movie stand out? The answer was style. Vaughn wasn't interested in making a movie that simply copied James Bond. Instead, he wanted to create something that understood the history of spy cinema well enough to play with it. The film could reference the traditional gentleman spy while introducing a younger protagonist from a completely different social background. It could celebrate old-school tailoring while embracing modern technology. It could create sophisticated environments and then fill them with deliberately exaggerated action. That combination became one of the film's defining qualities. The influence of James Bond. James Bond was an obvious influence on the project. The Bond films established many of the conventions audiences now associate with spy cinema. The elegant hero. The expensive suits. The sophisticated gadgets. The exotic locations. The glamorous social environments. The powerful villain. The world-threatening scheme. Vaughn and the filmmakers were aware of this history. But rather than simply imitate Bond, they wanted to examine the conventions of the genre. One of the more unusual creative choices came from Vaughn's observation about the treatment of sexual humor in Bond movies. He felt that sexual innuendo in those films frequently came from the male perspective. That observation influenced his approach to one of Kingsman's more controversial moments involving Princess Tilda. The filmmakers attempted to reverse the expected dynamic by having a female character openly express sexual interest. The intention was to play with the conventions of the traditional spy genre and its treatment of sexuality. However, the scene generated significant criticism when the film was released. Some critics interpreted it as unnecessarily crude or misogynistic rather than as satire. The controversy illustrates one of the risks of Vaughn's approach. When a film deliberately pushes genre conventions to extremes, audiences may interpret the joke very differently from the filmmaker's intentions. An alternate version was considered. The production history becomes particularly interesting because an alternate version of the movie was filmed. This version removed the controversial sexual material and other references connected to it. The existence of an alternate cut demonstrates that the filmmakers were aware of the possibility that the scene could affect the movie's reception. Ultimately, the released version retained the material. For a YouTube analysis, this production detail is important because it shows that the controversial moment wasn't simply an accidental part of the finished film. It emerged from a deliberate attempt to challenge established spy film conventions. At the same time, the reaction to it demonstrates the difficulty of mixing parody with material that some audiences may find uncomfortable. Mark Millar's contribution. Mark Millar played a central role in the project's development. Miller was already known for comic book storytelling that often combined traditional heroic concepts with exaggerated violence, humor, and unconventional characters. His approach was particularly suited to the kind of spy story Vaughn wanted to create. The source material, the Secret Service, provided the foundation for the cinematic adaptation. But the film wasn't simply a literal transfer of the comic to the screen. The filmmakers had to determine which ideas would work in a feature film and how to create a coherent cinematic world. The result was a movie that maintained the comic's irreverent spirit while developing its own visual and emotional identity. Matthew Vaughn's creative philosophy. Vaughn's approach to filmmaking is especially important when discussing the production of Kingsman. He has frequently demonstrated an interest in genre movies that can be entertaining without being conventional. His earlier work had already shown an ability to combine comedy, action, stylization, and unusual characters. With Kingsman, he had an opportunity to take that philosophy further. Instead of making the movie feel like a realistic intelligence thriller, he created a heightened universe. In this world, secret agents can wear custom-made suits that function as protective equipment. Ordinary objects can become advanced weapons. A gentleman can enter a violent confrontation without losing his composure. And a billionaire can attempt to solve a global environmental crisis through an absurdly extreme technological plan. The production therefore required a filmmaking style that could support this exaggeration. Balancing comedy and action. One of the greatest production challenges was tonal balance. If the movie became too comedic, the characters might stop feeling believable.
Designing the characters. Character design was equally important. Eggsy needed to look different from Harry. Harry represents the established Kingsman tradition. Eggsy represents someone entering that world from outside. That contrast needed to be visible. The same applies to Richmond Valentine. He shouldn't look like a conventional military dictator. His appearance is more eccentric and contemporary. His clothing, mannerisms, and behavior make him look like a wealthy technology entrepreneur rather than a traditional supervillain. That design choice supports the film's larger commentary on modern technology and power. Developing Richmond Valentine. The villain was designed to be fundamentally different from classic spy antagonists. Traditional Bond villains often appear as cold masterminds or powerful figures seeking world domination. Valentine is different. He presents himself as a philanthropist. He is concerned about environmental problems. He believes he is helping humanity. But his solution is horrifying. He wants to manipulate human behavior on a global scale. This makes him a product of the modern technological world. He doesn't need an army in the traditional sense. He has technology. He has money. He has global networks. He has access to communication systems. The production therefore connects the spy genre with contemporary concerns about technology and global connectivity. The importance of the comic book foundation. Because the film was based on a comic series, the filmmakers had greater freedom to embrace exaggerated visuals. Comic books can move quickly between realism and fantasy. They can present characters performing extraordinary actions without requiring every detail to obey real-world physics. The film adopts some of that philosophy. Action sequences become highly stylized. Movement becomes exaggerated. Camera work becomes energetic. The overall presentation is designed to feel larger than reality. This was a deliberate production choice. The filmmakers wanted audiences to experience action almost like turning the pages of a comic book at high speed. Building the action style. The action sequences became one of the movie's defining features. Rather than relying entirely on traditional coverage, the filmmakers used dynamic camera movement, choreography, editing, sound, and visual effects to create a heightened experience. The goal wasn't necessarily realism. The goal was energy. The audience should feel the speed of the action. They should understand where the characters are moving. And they should feel the rhythm of the fight. This approach became particularly visible in Harry's major combat sequences. His elegant appearance contrasts with the intensity of his movements. That contradiction is one of the movie's visual signatures. The role of technology. Technology is another major part of the production concept. The Kingsman gadgets are designed to feel futuristic while remaining connected to recognizable objects. This is a classic spy movie tradition. But Kingsman exaggerates it. The gadgets aren't merely convenient tools. They become extensions of the characters. Technology also drives the villain's plan. Valentine's SIM card system demonstrates how something ordinary can become a tool of global manipulation. This makes the film's technology both entertaining and narratively important. Filming the world of Kingsman. The filmmakers wanted the movie to retain a strong British identity. Locations in Surrey and London were used during principal photography. London was particularly important because the city itself has a long relationship with British spy fiction. Using recognizable British environments allowed the movie to connect its exaggerated secret agent mythology to a real cultural setting. At the same time, the production expands beyond Britain. The story eventually takes characters to locations associated with Valentine's global operation. This gives the movie an international scale. The production timeline. Principal photography began in October 2013. That meant the filmmakers had to move from development into full-scale production relatively quickly. The project required extensive action choreography, elaborate sets, costumes, technology-based props, visual effects, and location work. The film's ambitious style meant that production had to coordinate many different departments. Actors needed extensive preparation for action scenes. Stunt performers and choreographers had to design sequences that were both safe and visually impressive. The camera teams had to capture rapid movement without losing clarity. Visual effects teams had to integrate digital elements into practical environments. All of these departments contributed to the final experience. The importance of practical performance. One reason the action feels distinctive is the emphasis on physical performance. The actors weren't simply standing in front of green screens while computers created the action around them. Physical choreography was an important part of the filmmaking process. This was particularly significant for Colin Firth. His transformation into an action performer required substantial physical preparation. The production had to make his combat abilities convincing. That meant training, choreography, rehearsal, and precise camera work. The result is one of the film's most memorable surprises. Audiences who associated Firth primarily with dramatic and romantic roles suddenly saw him functioning as a highly capable action hero. The music. The film's score was composed by Henry Jackman and Matthew Margeson. Music plays an important role in maintaining the movie's unusual balance. It supports the spy film atmosphere while also contributing to the modern action energy. The score helps transition the audience between humor, suspense, emotion, and spectacle. In an action comedy with frequent tonal changes, music becomes especially important. It tells the audience how to experience each moment. A dramatic scene can receive emotional weight. A chaotic sequence can become exhilarating. A humorous moment can receive just enough emphasis to land effectively. The challenge of making the movie feel cohesive. The greatest production challenge may have been making all these contrasting elements feel like part of the same movie. Consider what Kingsman contains. A working-class coming-of-age story. A traditional British gentleman spy. A comic book-inspired action style. A billionaire environmental extremist. Advanced technology. Family drama.
Political satire. Spy movie parody. Dark comedy. Romantic and sexual humor. The filmmakers had to make these ingredients coexist. That required strong control of tone. The answer was to embrace exaggeration. Rather than trying to hide the movie's contradictions, Vaughan made those contradictions part of its identity. The controversial material. The film's development also involved decisions surrounding sexual humor. Vaughan's examination of classic spy movies led him to consider how sexual innuendo was traditionally handled in the genre. This influenced a controversial scene involving Princess Tilda. The scene was intended to reverse the usual dynamic by allowing the female character to express sexual desire directly. However, the sequence received criticism after release, with some commentators arguing that it crossed the line from parody into misogynistic humor. The controversy demonstrates a broader challenge in genre filmmaking. Satire depends on context. A filmmaker may intend to criticize a convention while some viewers may interpret the scene as simply repeating that convention. An alternate version was reportedly cut during production that removed the scene and related references. This detail shows how the filmmakers considered different approaches before settling on the final presentation. For a production analysis, the controversy is useful because it reveals how deliberately the film pushed against conventional spy movie boundaries. The risk behind the production. Ultimately, Kingsman, The Secret Service was a creative gamble. Vaughn left a major superhero project to make it. The movie was based on a comic property that wasn't as universally recognized as some of the industry's biggest franchises. Its tone was intentionally strange. Its action was highly stylized. Its humor was sometimes provocative. And its story deliberately challenged familiar genre conventions. Yet those risks became part of the movie's appeal. Instead of looking like another generic spy adventure, Kingsman had an identity. Audiences could immediately recognize it. The suits. The gadgets. The British humor. The exaggerated action. The unusual villain. The combination of elegance and chaos. All of these elements created something distinct. Why the development decisions worked. Looking back, the early development decisions explain much of the film's eventual success. Vaughn's decision to prioritize Kingsman allowed him to maintain creative control over a project he strongly believed in. His collaboration with Mark Millar provided a comic book foundation. The screenplay's willingness to parody classic spy conventions created a unique tone. The casting of actors like Colin Firth and Samuel L. Jackson gave the project star power. The choice of Taron Egerton provided a young protagonist who could carry the emotional story. The production design and costume work created a recognizable visual world. The action choreography gave the movie a signature style. And the music helped tie all those elements together. Final production assessment. The production of Kingsman, The Secret Service is ultimately a story about creative confidence. Matthew Vaughn saw an opportunity to make a spy movie that didn't take the genre's traditional rules too seriously. He and Mark Millar began with the idea of making espionage fun again. From there, the project developed into a film that deliberately combined old-school British elegance with modern technology, comic book action, exaggerated villains, and a young underdog protagonist. The decision to walk away from X-Men, Days of Future Past demonstrated how strongly Vaughn believed in the project. The screenplay's relationship with classic James Bond conventions gave the film its satirical edge. The comic book source material gave the filmmakers freedom to embrace exaggeration. The costumes, gadgets, sets, locations, choreography, music, and performances all contributed to the same goal, creating a spy universe that felt familiar but different. And perhaps that is the most important thing to understand about the movie's production. Kingsman, The Secret Service wasn't created because audiences needed another conventional spy film. It was created because the filmmakers believed the genre could still surprise people. They wanted to take the traditional gentleman spy and place him beside a young man from a very different world. They wanted to turn suits into armor, umbrellas into weapons, and ordinary technology into tools capable of changing the fate of the planet. They wanted action that looked like a comic book. They wanted comedy that could sit beside genuine emotion. And they wanted a film that could make audiences laugh one moment and become completely invested in the characters the next. That ambition explains why the movie developed such a distinctive personality. Its production was not simply about putting a screenplay on screen. It was about building a new interpretation of the spy genre. The result was a film that paid tribute to the movies that came before it while refusing to behave exactly like them. And that creative contradiction became the secret behind Kingsman, The Secret Service. It looked backward to classic espionage while moving forward with a modern comic book sensibility. It celebrated elegance while embracing chaos. It used familiar spy conventions while constantly exaggerating them. Most importantly, it was built around the idea that a spy movie could once again be allowed to have fun. That philosophy shaped nearly every production decision, from Vaughn's decision to choose the project, to the screenplay's unconventional humor, to the costumes, technology, action design, casting, and visual style. In the end, Kingsman, The Secret Service became more than an adaptation. It became a statement about what the filmmakers believed the spy genre could be. One of the biggest reasons Kingsman, The Secret Service works so well is that its casting feels almost like part of the movie's joke, and part of its genius. At first glance, the film looks like a traditional British spy adventure. There is the impeccably dressed gentleman agent, the eccentric billionaire villain, the secret organization, advanced gadgets, beautiful locations, and a young recruit who must prove himself. But underneath all of that is a clever casting strategy. The filmmakers didn't simply search for actors who could play action heroes. They looked for performers whose existing screen identities could be used, challenged, or completely turned upside down. The result is a fascinating mixture of established Hollywood stars, respected British performers, and younger actors who were still building their careers. At the center is Colin Firth, an actor audiences knew for sophistication and restraint, suddenly transformed into a highly capable action hero. Opposite him is Samuel L. Jackson, one of the most recognizable actors in modern cinema, playing a villain who is deliberately unlike the conventional intimidating mastermind. Then there is Taron Egerton, a young performer who had to carry the emotional journey of the film and convince audiences that an inexperienced young man could eventually become a Kingsman agent. Sophie Cookson was selected as a relatively less established performer for an important role, while Mark Hamill was brought into the project in a way that would be especially interesting to comic book fans. Together, these decisions helped create the unique personality of Kingsman, the Secret Service. Colin Firth, the first major piece of the puzzle. Colin Firth joined the cast on April 29, 2013. His casting was particularly significant because Harry Hart, also known by his Kingsman code name Galahad, needed to be more than a conventional action hero. The character had to look like the embodiment of the classic gentleman spy. He needed elegance. He needed intelligence. He needed authority. But he also needed to be convincing when the movie suddenly transformed into a highly energetic action spectacle. Firth was an inspired choice because his public image already carried many of the qualities the character required. Audiences knew him as an actor capable of playing refined, controlled, sophisticated characters. That made the transformation into Harry Hart particularly entertaining. Harry doesn't look like the typical action hero. He isn't introduced as a muscular soldier covered in tactical equipment. He is a sharply dressed gentleman. He speaks politely. He behaves calmly. He values manners. And yet, when circumstances demand it, he becomes extremely dangerous. That contrast is one of the film's greatest sources of entertainment. Why Firth was so important. The casting of Firth also helped communicate the movie's relationship with classic British spy cinema. Harry Hart feels like a character who could have stepped out of an older era of espionage. He has the confidence of a traditional gentleman agent. But Kingsman places him in a modern environment filled with smartphones, satellites, advanced weapons, and global technology. Firth becomes the bridge between those two worlds. He represents the old-fashioned idea of the gentleman spy while simultaneously proving that such a character can still work in a modern action film. The role also required physical preparation. Firth had to convince audiences that Harry was genuinely capable of handling himself in combat. That was a major challenge. It would have been easy for audiences to think of Firth primarily as a dramatic actor rather than an action performer. The production therefore needed his physical performance to feel credible. When Harry eventually enters combat, the surprise becomes part of the entertainment. The audience isn't merely watching an action scene. They are watching Colin Firth's established screen image being completely reinterpreted. And that is exactly what Kingsman wanted. Samuel L. Jackson, an unconventional villain. If Colin Firth represented the traditional gentleman spy, Samuel L. Jackson represented almost the opposite approach. Jackson was eventually hired to play Richmond Valentine, the film's central villain. Before Jackson was cast, there were reports suggesting that Leonardo DiCaprio might be in discussions to play the villain. Matthew Vaughn denied those reports. Eventually, the role went to Jackson. And Jackson turned out to be an exceptionally appropriate choice. Why? Because Richmond Valentine is not designed like a conventional spy villain. He isn't the silent, terrifying mastermind hiding in a dark room. He isn't constantly shouting. He doesn't behave like a traditional military dictator. Instead, Valentine is eccentric, wealthy, technologically obsessed, and strangely cheerful. He can discuss a horrifying plan while behaving almost like an enthusiastic businessman. That unusual personality required an actor who could command attention without constantly relying on physical intimidation. Samuel L. Jackson was perfect for that. Jackson's connection to James Bond. One of the most fascinating details about Jackson accepting the role was his long-standing interest in appearing in a James Bond film. Jackson had reportedly wanted to become part of the Bond universe for years. But when the opportunity to appear in an official Bond movie seemed unlikely, Kingsman offered him another possibility. Instead of playing a character inside the Bond franchise, he could play his own version of a great Bond-style villain. That made the role especially attractive. In a sense, Richmond Valentine became Jackson's opportunity to interact with the spy genre he admired while doing it on his own terms. Rather than reproducing the Bond villain formula, Jackson could exaggerate it. He could play with it. He could turn it into something deliberately strange. And that's exactly what happened. Richmond Valentine's unusual personality. One of the first things audiences notice about Valentine is that he doesn't behave like the villain they expect. He's friendly. He's conversational. He's often humorous. He has a strange fear of blood. He doesn't seem particularly interested in traditional villainous theatrics. That makes him difficult to predict. Jackson understands that the character should not simply be frightening. He should also be entertaining. That is crucial because Kingsman itself isn't a completely serious spy thriller. The villain has to belong to the same exaggerated world. Jackson gives Valentine an almost playful energy. The result is a villain who can make the audience laugh while still remaining responsible for an extremely dangerous plan. That balance is difficult. If Valentine were played too seriously, the movie's tone might become darker than intended. If he were played entirely as a joke, his threat would disappear. Jackson finds the middle ground. The story behind Valentine's lisp. Another memorable aspect of Jackson's performance is Valentine's distinctive speech pattern. The character has a notable lisp. According to Jackson, this was partly inspired by a stutter he experienced during childhood. This detail adds another layer to the character. The speech pattern makes Valentine immediately recognizable. Before he even does anything threatening, the audience can identify him simply by hearing him speak. That's important for a villain with such an unusual personality. The lisp becomes part of Valentine's identity. It isn't simply a random performance trick. It helps separate him from the countless serious, deep-voiced villains that have populated action cinema. Jackson essentially creates a villain who sounds as unusual as he behaves. Why Samuel L. Jackson was a smart choice. Casting Jackson also gave the movie instant credibility. By this point in his career, Jackson had already become one of the most recognizable actors in Hollywood. His presence brings energy to almost any scene. When he enters a movie, audiences immediately pay attention. That was useful for Kingsman because Valentine needed to feel important. He is responsible for a conspiracy involving global technology, political figures, and a plan capable of affecting millions of people. The actor needed to make that enormous threat believable. Jackson's reputation helps. But instead of simply relying on his intimidating persona, the film uses his versatility. The result is one of the movie's most memorable performances. Sophie Cookson, choosing a fresh face. In September 2013, Matthew Vaughn cast Sophie Cookson as the female lead, Roxanne "Roxy" Morton. This was another interesting casting decision because Vaughn reportedly preferred a less established actor for the part. Cookson was selected over more recognizable names, including Emma Watson and Bella Heathcote. That decision tells us something important about the filmmaker's approach. They didn't necessarily want every major role to be filled by the biggest possible star. They wanted actors who felt right for the characters. Roxy needed to feel like a genuine recruit. She had to stand alongside Eggsy as someone who was equally capable of becoming a Kingsman agent. If the role had been dominated by a huge celebrity presence, it could have distracted from the character. Instead, Cookson brought a relatively fresh screen presence. That helped Roxy feel like a new member of this world. Roxy as Eggsy's equal. Roxy is important because she isn't simply there to support Eggsy. She is one of his strongest competitors during the Kingsman training process. She is intelligent. She is determined. She is physically capable. She handles the recruitment challenges effectively. Most importantly, she succeeds where Eggsy initially fails. She becomes the new Lancelot. That makes her character essential to the story. Cookson plays Roxy with confidence without turning her into an exaggerated action stereotype. There is a sense that she genuinely belongs in the Kingsman organization. Her friendship with Eggsy also gives the recruitment storyline another dimension. They compete against each other, but they aren't simply enemies. They recognize one another's potential. That relationship makes the training sequences more engaging. Why choosing Sophie Cookson worked? Casting a less established performer helped preserve the feeling that Roxy was a character rather than a celebrity cameo. This is particularly useful in an ensemble movie. The audience needs to believe that these young recruits are entering a world they have never experienced before. Cookson's relative lack of mainstream recognition helped achieve that. Instead of thinking, here comes a famous actress playing a spy, audiences could simply focus on Roxy. That allowed the character to develop naturally. Her eventual success also feels earned. Mark Hamill, a fascinating comic book connection. Another especially interesting casting decision was Mark Hamill as Professor James Arnold. Hamill's presence carries enormous significance because of his association with comic books and science fiction cinema. For audiences familiar with his career, seeing him appear in Kingsman creates an additional layer of amusement. But his role is not what some viewers might expect. Professor James Arnold is an academic whose connection to the larger conspiracy becomes one of the early clues in the story. In the comic source material, Professor Arnold had a significantly different role. The film changes the character. That transformation is important because it demonstrates that the filmmakers weren't simply copying the comic. They were adapting it. Changing Professor Arnold for the film. In the comic series, Professor James Arnold is the primary antagonist. The movie changes that. Instead of being the central villain, Arnold becomes part of the mystery surrounding Richmond Valentine's operation. His disappearance and eventual return help Harry Hart and the Kingsman organization investigate what is happening. When Harry attempts to question him, Arnold's implanted microchip becomes a deadly piece of evidence. That changes the character's function completely. Mark Hamill therefore becomes part of the film's mystery rather than its ultimate villain. This is an excellent example of adaptation. A character can retain the same name and general identity while serving a completely different purpose in the cinematic version. The importance of casting familiar faces. The filmmakers also benefited from the presence of actors who carried strong associations from previous work. Colin Firth brought refinement. Samuel L. Jackson brought charisma and unpredictability. Mark Hamill brought comic book and science fiction recognition. These familiar faces helped give the film credibility. At the same time, younger actors such as Taron Egerton and Sophie Cookson provided the sense of discovery necessary for the new generation of Kingsman recruits. That mixture was carefully balanced, Taron Egerton and the search for Eggsy. Although the supplied casting history focuses on Firth, Jackson, Cookson, and Hamill, the casting of Taron Egerton deserves special attention because Eggsy is the film's central character. The role required a very specific combination of qualities. Eggsy had to be rough around the edges but sympathetic. He needed humor. He needed vulnerability. He needed physical ability. And most importantly, he needed to undergo a believable transformation. At the beginning of the movie, Eggsy is a young man who has enormous potential but little direction. By the end, he has become a confident Kingsman agent. The actor therefore had to carry the movie's emotional development. Egerton succeeds because he doesn't make Eggsy's transformation feel instantaneous. Instead, the character learns gradually. He fails. He becomes frustrated. He doubts himself. He discovers what he is capable of. And eventually he understands what it means to take responsibility. That journey gives the film its heart. Colin Firth and Taron Egerton, the central casting contrast. The relationship between Firth and Egerton is arguably the most important casting combination in the movie. Harry and Eggsy come from very different backgrounds. Harry is polished. Eggsy is rougher. Harry has years of experience. Eggsy is just beginning. Harry understands the rules. Eggsy often breaks them. Yet the two characters need one another. Harry provides Eggsy with direction. Eggsy reminds Harry why the Kingsman tradition needs a new generation. The actors make that relationship believable. Firth gives Harry the confidence of an experienced mentor. Egerton gives Eggsy the uncertainty of someone searching for a purpose. Together, they create the emotional center of the film. Casting as a reflection of the movie's themes. The casting decisions also mirror one of the movie's central themes, old versus new. Colin Firth represents the old-school gentleman spy. Taron Egerton represents the younger generation. Michael Caine's presence represents established authority. Sophie Cookson represents new talent. Samuel L. Jackson represents a modern technology-driven villain. Mark Hamill provides a connection between the comic book source material and the cinematic adaptation. The cast itself therefore reflects the movie's larger conversation about changing traditions. The old methods aren't necessarily useless. The new generation isn't automatically better. The movie argues that the future of Kingsman comes from combining the best qualities of both. Why the casting was essential to the tone. The tone of Kingsman is difficult to describe. It's part spy movie, part action comedy, part coming-of-age story, part comic book adventure, part parody. That means the actors needed to understand the tone. If everyone played the movie completely seriously, the humor would become weaker. If everyone played it as a comedy, the emotional moments would lose their impact. The cast solves this problem by committing to their characters. Colin Firth doesn't wink at the camera while playing Harry. Samuel L. Jackson doesn't behave as though Valentine knows he's in a comedy. Taron Egerton doesn't treat Eggsy's family problems as a joke. Sophie Cookson plays Roxy as a serious competitor. That sincerity makes the humor stronger. The risk of casting against type. Perhaps the smartest element of the casting strategy was the decision to use actors in unexpected ways. Colin Firth becomes an action star. Samuel L. Jackson becomes a comedic eccentric villain. Mark Hamill appears in a role that deliberately differs from the expectations surrounding his comic book legacy. A relatively less established Sophie Cookson becomes a capable spy recruit. And Taron Egerton emerges as the central hero of a major action franchise. This strategy gives the film freshness. Audiences don't always know exactly what to expect from these performers. That uncertainty becomes part of the entertainment. Casting and the film's relationship with James Bond. The James Bond influence becomes particularly interesting when viewed through casting. Kingsman clearly loves the traditional spy genre, but it also wants to reinvent it. Casting Colin Firth as Harry allows the movie to embrace the gentleman spy tradition. Casting Samuel L. Jackson as Valentine allows it to exaggerate the classic villain. The result is almost like a conversation between the old spy movie and the modern action film. Harry could exist in an older espionage adventure. Valentine could exist in a modern technological thriller. Eggsy belongs somewhere between the two. That mixture creates the identity of Kingsman. The actors had to sell the absurdity. One of the biggest challenges for the cast was making extraordinary situations feel believable. The movie contains technology that would seem ridiculous in a grounded thriller. It has secret agents using customized gadgets. It has an eccentric billionaire with a global plan. It has a young recruit transforming into a highly trained operative. The actors couldn't constantly react as though everything was ridiculous. They had to accept the world. That's why the performances work. The characters behave as though the Kingsman organization is real. Harry believes in it. Merlin believes in it. Eggsy gradually learns to believe in it. Valentine believes in his own mission. That internal sincerity allows the audience to accept the film's heightened reality. The casting of the villain was especially important. A weak villain can undermine an entire spy movie. Valentine needed to be memorable because the protagonist's journey depends on him. The villain has to create a threat large enough to justify the existence of Kingsman.
Eggsy represents the new. And the movie needs both. The same philosophy applies to the cast. Established performers stand beside emerging talent. Classic spy movie characteristics stand beside modern comic book exaggeration. Traditional British elegance stands beside contemporary technology. The filmmakers took familiar pieces and placed them in unexpected combinations. That is ultimately what makes the casting so effective. When Colin Firth walks into a room wearing an immaculate suit, audiences immediately understand the classic spy archetype. When Samuel L. Jackson begins speaking as Richmond Valentine, that archetype is transformed into something stranger and more playful. When Taron Egerton appears as Eggsy, the movie shifts again, from established gentleman spy to young outsider trying to find his place. And when Sophie Cookson's Roxy demonstrates that Eggsy isn't the only talented recruit, the film expands its idea of what the next generation of Kingsman could look like. These performances give the movie its personality. Without the right actors, the film's strange mixture of action, comedy, espionage, satire, and emotion could easily have collapsed under its own weight. Instead, the cast sells it. They treat the characters seriously enough for the emotional moments to matter, while allowing the exaggerated world to remain entertaining. That is why the casting of Kingsman, the Secret Service, deserves to be considered one of the film's most important production achievements. The movie didn't simply assemble a group of talented performers. It assembled actors whose careers, personalities, and screen images could be used to create something unexpected. Colin Firth became the gentleman action hero. Samuel L. Jackson became the eccentric Bond-inspired villain he had always wanted to play. Sophie Cookson emerged as a new face within the spy world. Mark Hamill became part of a clever adaptation that transformed his comic book connection into something unexpected. And Taron Egerton became the young hero who would carry the Kingsman legacy forward. In the end, the casting perfectly captures what the entire film is trying to accomplish. Take something familiar, change the rules, add a little chaos, and make it feel completely new. That philosophy begins with the screenplay, continues through Matthew Vaughn's direction, and becomes fully alive through the actors. When Kingsman, the Secret Service, arrived on the big screen, audiences immediately noticed that it didn't look like a typical modern spy movie. It had the polished suits and sophisticated locations associated with classic British espionage, but it also had explosive action, exaggerated choreography, comic book visuals, outrageous gadgets, and a playful sense of humor. That distinctive look wasn't created by accident. Behind the finished movie was an ambitious production that combined real British locations, carefully chosen interiors, practical filmmaking, visual effects, elaborate action choreography, and a soundtrack designed to give the film its own personality. The filmmakers wanted Kingsman to feel familiar enough that audiences would recognize the classic spy genre, but different enough that it would never feel like another imitation. The filming process was therefore extremely important. From Eggsy's working-class neighborhood to the sophisticated streets of Mayfair, the locations were chosen to create a visual contrast between two worlds. On one side is Eggsy's difficult life. On the other is the secret world of Kingsman. And connecting those worlds is the film's visual language. Sharp tailoring, British architecture, dynamic action, and music that can turn a violent confrontation into something almost operatic. Principal photography begins. Principal photography officially began on October 6, 2013, in Deep Cut, Surrey. This marked the transition from planning and preparation into the demanding process of actually creating the movie. The production reportedly had a budget around one-third of the approximately $200 million budget associated with Skyfall. That comparison is particularly interesting because Skyfall represented the enormous scale of a major James Bond production. Kingsman, by comparison, had considerably fewer resources. Yet the filmmakers still wanted the movie to feel large. They wanted sophisticated locations. They wanted spectacular action. They wanted elaborate visual effects. They wanted the audience to believe that this secret organization had existed for generations. That meant the production had to use its resources intelligently. Rather than attempting to compete with blockbuster spy films simply through scale, the filmmakers focused on style and creativity. This became one of the film's greatest strengths. Creating two different worlds. One of the most important visual ideas in Kingsman, The Secret Service, is the contrast between Egg's world and the world of Kingsman. Eggsy begins the story in a difficult environment. His life is surrounded by economic problems, family tension, and people who underestimate him. Then Harry Hart introduces him to an entirely different world. Suddenly, Eggsy is surrounded by tailored suits, expensive cars, secret technology, elegant buildings, and highly trained agents. The filmmakers needed locations that could communicate this transformation visually. That is why the production moved between very different parts of London and the surrounding area. The locations themselves become part of Egg's character journey. Alexandra Road Estate, Egg's home. The Alexandra Road Estate in Camden was used to depict Egg's home. This was an important choice because the filmmakers needed Egg's environment to feel completely different from the sophisticated world of Kingsman. The location communicates a sense of ordinary urban life. Eggsy isn't introduced as someone born into luxury. He doesn't grow up surrounded by wealth or privilege. His environment helps explain why he feels disconnected from the world that Harry eventually introduces him to. This visual contrast is essential to the story. When audiences later see Eggsy wearing an elegant Kingsman suit, the transformation has more impact because they remember where he came from. The suit isn't just clothing. It represents a new possibility.
The tailoring district is real. But the secret organization hiding underneath that world is fictional. That combination makes the story more convincing. The audience can recognize the world around the characters while simultaneously accepting that something extraordinary might be hidden beneath it. This is a classic technique in spy storytelling. The secret world works because it appears to exist underneath the ordinary world. Imperial College London. Some scenes were filmed at Imperial College London. The location helped provide the film with a credible academic and institutional atmosphere. This was particularly useful because Professor James Arnold's storyline is connected to the academic world. Using a recognizable university environment helps establish the scientific and intellectual side of Valentine's operation. It also reinforces one of the movie's recurring themes: modern technology and scientific knowledge are deeply connected to the story. Valentine isn't simply a traditional criminal mastermind. His plan depends heavily on communications technology and global systems. Therefore, academic and technological environments fit naturally into the visual world of the movie. The Black Prince Pub. The Black Prince Pub in Kennington was used for various scenes, including fight sequences and the car chase. This is another example of how the production used ordinary British locations and transformed them into action movie environments. A pub might normally be associated with casual social life. But in Kingsman, it becomes part of the action. That contrast fits the movie perfectly. The film constantly takes familiar British institutions and places them inside an exaggerated spy adventure. The pub is ordinary. The events happening around it are anything but ordinary. The pub fight and Kingsman's identity. The fight sequences are especially important because they establish the movie's approach to action. Kingsman doesn't always pursue gritty realism. Instead, it often treats action like choreography. Movements are precise. Camera work is energetic. The editing creates rhythm. Characters move through environments with almost dance-like precision. This approach makes the fights visually distinctive. The audience isn't simply watching people punch and kick. The action becomes part of the film's entertainment language. The contrast between sophisticated surroundings and explosive violence makes the sequences even more memorable. The car chase. The Black Prince pub was also connected to the filming of the car chase. Vehicle sequences can be expensive and complicated to produce. They require stunt drivers, safety teams, camera operators, location coordination, and careful planning. The filmmakers had to create excitement without losing the personality of the movie. A conventional car chase might emphasize realism. A Kingsman chase is more interested in style. The vehicles become part of the spectacle. The environment becomes part of the choreography. And the editing helps maintain the energetic tone. Savile Row, the home of Kingsman. Perhaps no location is more important to the identity of the film than Savile Row in Mayfair. This famous London street is internationally associated with high-quality tailoring. That made it an ideal location for the Kingsman headquarters. The organization hides behind the appearance of a prestigious tailoring business. This isn't simply a clever plot device. It is a visual representation of the Kingsman philosophy. The organization believes in elegance. It believes in presentation. It believes that a gentleman should be capable of handling himself while maintaining impeccable manners. Savile Row therefore becomes almost a character in the film. Huntsman and the Kingsman headquarters. The exterior of Huntsman was used to represent the Kingsman headquarters. The filmmakers also worked with Huntsman and James Lock and Company, both of which contributed clothing and hats for the movie. This gave the production an authentic connection to British tailoring. That authenticity mattered. The Kingsman aesthetic depends on the idea that clothing is more than decoration. The suit is part of the character. It represents professionalism, discipline, confidence, and tradition. The production designers therefore had a powerful real-world environment from which to build the fictional Kingsman world. The importance of the suit. The suit is one of the most recognizable symbols in Kingsman. But its significance goes deeper than fashion. Ex's transformation is partly expressed through clothing. At the beginning, he doesn't fit into the sophisticated environment occupied by Harry. He looks like an outsider. As his training progresses, he learns how to dress, move, speak, and behave differently. The suit becomes a visual marker of his development. But the movie also makes the suit functional. Kingsman's clothing is connected to their equipment and technology. This turns traditional British tailoring into something almost futuristic. That mixture of old and new is one of the film's most important visual ideas. James Lock and Company and authentic details. James Lock and Company also contributed clothing and hats. These details helped the production create a believable gentleman spy aesthetic. Hats, suits, tailoring, and accessories aren't simply background decoration. They establish the culture of Kingsman. The organization is built around tradition. Its members don't simply want to become effective spies. They want to become gentlemen. That philosophy is visually communicated through every detail of their appearance. Practical locations and cinematic fantasy. One of the reasons Kingsman feels visually distinctive is that it combines real places with heightened filmmaking. The audience recognizes real London locations. But the camera, lighting, production design, action choreography, and visual effects transform those spaces. This is particularly effective in the action sequences. The filmmakers aren't trying to hide the fact that they're making an entertainment spectacle. Instead, they embrace it. The real world becomes a playground for exaggerated action. The exploding head sequence. One of the most visually unusual sequences in the movie is the scene involving the exploding heads of Valentine's allies. The filmmakers wanted the moment to resemble what was described as a surreal and enjoyable Busby Berkeley firework display. That comparison is revealing. Busby Berkeley was famous for elaborate musical choreography featuring synchronized movement and large-scale visual patterns. The Kingsman sequence takes that concept and turns it into something dramatically different. Instead of dancers creating patterns, the film uses spectacular visual effects. The result is intentionally absurd. It transforms an otherwise horrifying event into a visually extravagant spectacle. That tonal contradiction is central to Kingsman. Finding the right effects studio. Matthew Vaughn reportedly visited 3 different effects studios while searching for the right way to achieve the sequence. The filmmakers didn't simply want a technically impressive effect. They wanted something surreal. They wanted it to be visually entertaining. And they wanted it to fit the movie's exaggerated style. Eventually, Vaughn commissioned the third effects house to create the sequence. That process demonstrates how much thought can go into a scene that lasts only a short amount of screen time. The audience sees the finished result in seconds. But behind those seconds are discussions about design, visual effects, timing, color, movement, composition, editing, and tone. Why the effects matter. The exploding head sequence represents the movie's entire philosophy in miniature. It's violent. It's absurd. It's colorful. It's exaggerated. It's almost celebratory in presentation. A more conventional spy thriller might have treated the moment with horror. Kingsman turns it into spectacle. That doesn't necessarily mean the filmmakers are ignoring the seriousness of what is happening. Instead, they are deliberately pushing the movie into comic book territory. The visual style of the action. Action filmmaking is one of the areas where Kingsman distinguishes itself most clearly. The filmmakers wanted fights to feel energetic and carefully choreographed. Rather than simply filming actors from a distance while stunt doubles handled everything, the production built sequences around movement. The camera becomes part of the choreography. Editing becomes part of the choreography. Sound becomes part of the choreography. The result is a style that feels almost musical. This approach is especially important because the film's comedy often comes from contrast. A character may look completely elegant while performing extremely aggressive action. That contradiction becomes funnier and more exciting when the camera emphasizes the precision of the movements. The church sequence. The church sequence is arguably the ultimate example of the film's approach to action and music. The scene is designed as a long, escalating action set piece. Harry enters the church and becomes caught in an extraordinary confrontation. The filmmakers needed music capable of matching the intensity of the sequence. And this is where one of the production's most interesting musical decisions appears. The original plan, November Rain. Matthew Vaughn originally intended to use Guns N' Roses' November Rain for the church fight. The song was considered for its dramatic quality and its famous guitar work. However, Vaughn eventually decided that it didn't fit the sequence as well as he had hoped. He reportedly felt that the song was darker than he had realized and that its guitar solo was too short. This created a problem. The scene needed a long piece of music that could sustain the action. The filmmakers therefore looked for another option. Discovering Free Bird. The solution was LYNYRD-SKYNYRD's Free Bird. According to the production account, Vaughn searched online for great long American guitar solos. That search led to the use of Free Bird. It was a surprisingly effective choice. The song's extended guitar section provides enough musical space for the action to develop. Instead of cutting the sequence around a short musical moment, the filmmakers could build the fight around the music. The guitar solo essentially becomes a second choreography. The action and music rise together. Giles Martin's contribution. Giles Martin, son of legendary producer George Martin and a friend of Matthew Vaughn, remixed the song for the film from its original stems. This allowed the filmmakers to shape the track for the needs of the sequence. Rather than simply placing the original recording underneath the footage, the production could work with the individual musical components. That gave the filmmakers greater flexibility. The music could support the pacing of the scene more effectively. Why Free Bird works so well? The choice of Free Bird is one of those creative decisions that seems obvious after seeing the finished movie. The song is huge. The guitar solo is extended. The emotional build is powerful. And the music has a distinctly American rock identity. Putting that music underneath an elaborate British spy action sequence creates another layer of contrast. The movie is constantly mixing cultural references.